But that wasn't who he was anymore. For the first time, Elijah could see his future clearly, not through the lens of fear, but through the lens of possibility. He didn't have all the answers, and he knew there would be days when he faltered. But he also knew he could face those days, just like he had faced everything else. One step at a time. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from Trey. "Yo, summer's here. You down to hang out?" Elijah smiled, his heart lifting. For the first time, he felt like he had a place in this world. He wasn't alone anymore. "Yeah, I'm in," he typed back. He hit send and shoved the phone into his pocket, his mind buzzing with excitement for the first time in a long while. He didn't have everything figured out, but he didn't need to. The future wasn't something to be feared, it was something to be embraced. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the courtyard, Elijah took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his journey behind him, and the promise of his future ahead. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living. As the school year came to a close, Elijah looked back on everything he had learned. It wasn't just the lessons from his classes that had shaped him, it was the lessons he had learned about himself, about strength, and about redemption. With the help of Bradley, Mrs. Keller, and his friends, Elijah had made it through. And while he knew the road ahead would still have its obstacles, he no longer faced it alone. He was ready to step forward, to build the future he deserved, and to continue proving to himself that no matter where he came from, he could choose who he would become. This concludes the story of Elijah's journey from struggle to strength, with the support of those around him, showing that even the hardest paths can lead to the brightest futures. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? He turned a corner and saw him. A boy, curled into himself between two shelves. Hood pulled up over his head, arms wrapped tight around his knees. Blake recognized him immediately. Elijah Carter. 7th grade. Quiet. Always in the back row. He had big eyes that looked older than his age, and a way of disappearing even when he was present. Blake had passed him in the halls 100 times, but they had never spoken for more than a moment. The boy didn't notice him at first. Blake stepped closer, gently clearing his throat. Elijah flinched, startled. He wiped at his face quickly, trying to hide the tears. I didn't know anyone was here," Elijah whispered. "I could say the same," Blake replied gently. "Library's closed, son." Elijah nodded, but didn't move. Blake looked around. No backpack. No books. Just a boy sitting in the dark, like the library had become a hiding place. "You okay?" Blake asked, kneeling down to his level. "I'm fine." But the answer came too fast. Too flat. There was a pause. The kind that feels like it stretches longer than it should. Blake studied the boy's face, red-rimmed eyes, lips pressed together, trying hard not to tremble. He wasn't just having a bad day. This was something else. Something deeper. "You know," Blake said, keeping his voice low, "I came in here to be alone too." Elijah looked up, surprised. "Why?" "Sometimes the quiet helps," Blake said. "Helps me think." Elijah didn't respond right away. Then he murmured, almost inaudibly, "I don't like going home." The words hit Blake like a chill wind. He nodded slowly, not pressing. He knew better than to pry. Not yet. Instead, he sat back, leaning against the shelf beside Elijah. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the rain tapping gently against the windows. "I used to come here when I was a kid," Blake said eventually. "Not this exact library, but one a lot like it. Books were the only place that made sense sometimes." Elijah tilted his head slightly, as if listening. "My mom used to say books don't judge you. They don't ask you to be someone else. They just let you in. A breath passed between them. Yeah, Elijah whispered. I like that. Blake turned toward him. You're not in trouble, Elijah. You shouldn't be here this late, sure. But I'm not going to write you up. Elijah nodded. Thanks. You want me to call someone? Your mom? Or? No, Elijah said quickly. She's working. She doesn't know I stay. Blake frowned but nodded. All right. But we can't make this a habit, okay? Elijah didn't respond, but his body seemed to relax just a little. Blake stood up, brushing dust off his slacks. Come on. I'll walk you out. The boy rose slowly. Still quiet. Still holding something tight inside. As they walked down the hallway together, their footsteps side by side, Blake found himself saying, You know, Elijah, sometimes we don't say what's really going on because we don't think anyone would listen. Elijah looked up at him, silent. Blake met his gaze. I'm listening. The boy didn't answer, but something in his eyes shifted. The walls were still there, but maybe, just maybe, a crack had formed. They reached the front door. Blake held it open. Where are you headed? Bus stop, Elijah said. It's not far. Blake glanced out at the rain. You have a jacket? Elijah shook his head. Without a word, Blake took off his own coat and draped it over the boy's shoulders. Just for tonight, he said. You bring it back Monday. Elijah nodded slowly. Okay. As the boy stepped into the rain, Blake stood in the doorway watching him disappear into the night. For a moment, he saw his own son at that age, same small shoulders, same way of walking like the world was heavier than it should be. He shut the door gently behind him. Back in the empty hallway, the silence returned. But this time, it didn't feel so lonely. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Thomas Blake's life was one of routines. They had been his anchor when his wife, Anne, passed away. It was a quiet death, a car accident late at night when the rain had been just as relentless as it was tonight. That was nearly 10 years ago now. He'd never quite gotten used to it. The hole she left in their home remained untouched, like a room that had been sealed off, too painful to enter. Blake had always been a man of habits. He found comfort in the structure of his work as a school principal. Days blurred into one another, meeting with parents, overseeing teachers, addressing small issues with students. It was enough to fill his time, to numb him from the gnawing loneliness that visited when the office lights went out, and the final bell rang. The empty hours stretched ahead. His son, Ryan, had gone to college in another state a few months ago. Blake had waved him off at the airport, hiding his emotions behind a forced smile, giving him the typical, I'm proud of you, speech. But even as Ryan hugged him goodbye, Blake knew it wasn't just the physical distance that would change their relationship. His son was growing up, becoming someone who had a life outside of their home, just as Blake had once hoped he would. It was the quiet weight of things unsaid that lingered, even as Ryan drove away. Ryan's room, once a chaotic mess of posters and sports trophies, had been cleaned and reorganized the day after he left. Blake hadn't been able to leave it the way it was, a shrine to what used to be. Now, it stood like a museum, everything neat and orderly, but with no real life in it. Blake wasn't sure what he expected from the empty room. Perhaps he hoped it would feel more final. But it didn't. The silence there only made him feel more like a ghost, drifting through a space that no longer belonged to him. There was a small part of him that wished for the noise again. The laughter, the arguments over nothing, the calls for, Dad, I need help with my homework. But all of that had slipped away with the years, leaving him in a place of stillness. That was why, when Blake had wandered into the school's library after hours last night and found Elijah Carter sitting in the dark, something had stirred in him. The boy wasn't just another student. There was something about Elijah, something that reminded him of the boy he used to be. Quiet. Out of place. Alone. Blake sat in his office that morning, trying to focus on the stack of papers on his desk, but his mind kept drifting back to the boy. Elijah Carter, an enigma wrapped in silence. Blake couldn't quite explain it, but the way Elijah looked at him last night, eyes brimming with unspoken thoughts, unsettled him. Blake thought back to when he was a child, sitting in classrooms where the clock ticked louder than the teacher's voice. He had been one of those kids, quiet, withdrawn, often overlooked. Maybe that's why he understood Elijah, even if he didn't fully know the boy's story yet. Maybe that's why he didn't just let the matter slide when the kid was left to suffer in silence. The truth was, Blake had been trying to fill the silence in his own life for years, and here, right in front of him, was someone who was doing the same thing. But the problem was, Elijah wasn't doing it in the way Blake had. Elijah wasn't burying himself in work or busyness like Blake did. Instead, he hid in the shadows of the library, trying to stay invisible. Blake drummed his fingers against his desk, staring out the window into the empty parking lot. What was he supposed to do? He couldn't just ignore the boy, not after hearing him cry. He'd made a promise to himself a long time ago, he wouldn't be one of those people who turned a blind eye when someone was in pain. But Elijah wasn't just any student, and this wasn't just any problem. He needed to talk to someone about it, someone who might understand what Elijah was going through. Someone who might help him figure out how to navigate this delicate situation. That's when he remembered Ms. Hernandez, the school counselor. She'd been with the district for nearly 15 years and had an uncanny ability to get through to even the most difficult students. If anyone could shed light on Elijah's situation, it would be her. Blake stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the tile floor. He walked out of his office, glancing at the clock. It was almost lunchtime, but he needed to speak with Ms. Hernandez before the rest of the day took over. The hallway was empty as usual, quiet and still, like the rest of the school. The classrooms were filled with the low hum of lessons in progress, but Blake's footsteps echoed through the halls as he made his way to the counseling office. He knocked gently on the door before entering. Ms. Hernandez looked up from behind her desk, a warm smile lighting up her face. "Mr. Blake. What can I do for you?" she asked, her voice calm and welcoming. Blake hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to start. He had always kept his personal thoughts tucked away, especially when it came to his students. But something about Elijah's vulnerability had broken through the walls he'd built for himself. "I need your help," Blake said quietly. "It's about one of the students, Elijah Carter." Ms. Hernandez's expression shifted. She leaned forward, her tone becoming more serious. "What about him?" Blake glanced around the office, ensuring no one else was nearby. "I found him in the library last night, alone. He was crying." Ms. Hernandez's brow furrowed. "Crying? Elijah? That's unexpected. He's usually very closed off." Blake nodded. "Yeah, that's why I'm concerned. He doesn't talk much, and he doesn't seem to fit in with the other kids. But I don't know if there's something more going on. I think it's important that we keep an eye on him. I'm not sure what to do." Ms. Hernandez sighed, folding her hands in front of her. "Elijah has had a difficult time at home. His mother works late shifts at a diner, and he often takes care of his younger sister. There have been reports of some trouble at home, but nothing concrete. He's a good kid, but he's under a lot of stress." Blake felt a pang of guilt. He had known about Elijah's family situation, but he hadn't connected the dots. The boy was struggling, but he had been too wrapped up in his own loneliness to truly see it. "We need to make sure Elijah doesn't fall through the cracks," Ms. Hernandez continued. "If he's not getting the support he needs at home, we'll have to step in and find ways to help him at school." Blake nodded, a heavy weight settling on his shoulders. He wasn't sure if he was ready for this, but he knew he couldn't back down. "Not now. We'll find a way to help him," he said, his voice resolute. Ms. Hernandez smiled at him, her eyes filled with understanding. "I'll make sure to keep an eye on him, too. We'll work together." Blake left her office feeling the burden of responsibility pressing against him. But for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was doing something that mattered. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of a new chapter, both for Elijah and for him. The days that followed were strange for Principal Blake. Though he carried on with his usual duties, supervising teachers, meeting with parents, handling discipline issues, his mind was often elsewhere, lost in the memory of Elijah Carter's tear-streaked face in the library. He couldn't shake the image. It stuck with him like a splinter, small but persistent. Blake had always prided himself on being a man who was in the know at Fairhill Middle School. He had a sharp eye for students, could read their moods in the hallways, catch a glimpse of a troubled face and know instinctively when something wasn't right. But Elijah? Elijah was a mystery. Most of the time, the seventh grader seemed like any other quiet kid, keeping to the shadows, keeping his head down. But Blake had learned early on that kids like Elijah, quiet and withdrawn, often held the most complex stories. They didn't ask for help, didn't seek attention. They just dealt with things in their own way, often suffering in silence. After his conversation with Ms. Hernandez, Blake had tried to keep a closer eye on Elijah. He'd made small talk with the boy in passing, asking about his classes, his weekends, anything that might spark a real conversation. But Elijah's answers were always short, polite, and distant. He never went out of his way to talk. It was as though the walls he had built were stronger than any attempts Blake could make to break them down. It was Thursday when Blake decided to try again. He had no specific plan, no grand strategy, no clever way to fix things. But something had shifted in him. He knew Elijah needed more than just passive observation. He needed someone to show him that he wasn't invisible, that someone cared enough to understand his silence. The bell had just rung for lunch, and Blake was walking down the hall when he spotted Elijah. The boy was standing by his locker, adjusting the strap of his backpack with a quick, practiced motion, his eyes scanning the hallway as if he was trying to make himself as small as possible. Blake approached him slowly, offering a smile that he hoped didn't look forced. "Elijah," he said, his voice steady, but not overly loud. "Got a minute?" Elijah stiffened, but he didn't back away. He nodded and glanced up, just enough for their eyes to meet. "Yeah, Mr. Blake." His voice was soft, but it wasn't rude. More like he was trying to be respectful, but distant. "Thought you might want to join me for lunch today," Blake offered. He wasn't sure what made him extend the invitation, but he did it anyway. "We can eat in my office if you'd rather stay away from the cafeteria crowd." Elijah seemed to consider this for a moment, eyes flicking toward the bustling cafeteria in the distance. The sound of laughter and conversation echoed through the hallway, and Blake saw the way Elijah tensed. Maybe it was the noise, the crowd, or the feeling of being an outsider, but Elijah seemed uncomfortable in that space. I guess that's okay," Elijah said, shrugging his shoulders slightly. "I don't mind." Blake gave a small nod. "Great. Let's head there now." As they walked toward his office, Blake kept the conversation light, asking about Elijah's classes, the projects he was working on, but the boy's responses were short and unenthusiastic. It was clear that Elijah wasn't interested in talking about school or his interests. When they reached Blake's office, the principal motioned for Elijah to take a seat across from his desk. He sat down behind it and placed a few snacks in front of the boy, nothing fancy, just some fruit and granola bars, but it was an offering of comfort, a way to break the silence. They sat there for a while, the quiet stretching between them. Elijah picked at the fruit but didn't eat much. Blake watched him closely, trying to figure out what was going on behind those dark eyes. "You know," Blake began, his voice calm but inviting, "when I was a kid, I didn't like lunch periods either. Too many people, too much noise. I spent a lot of time sitting alone." Elijah glanced up at him, and Blake saw the faintest flicker of interest. "Yeah. Elijah said quietly. Yeah. I didn't always fit in, you know. Blake said. Still don't, sometimes. I think that's why I became a teacher. I wanted to make sure kids who felt the same way had someone to talk to. Blake let the words hang in the air, hoping Elijah would respond, but the boy stayed silent, focusing on his granola bar. Blake's eyes softened. He wanted to say more, to explain, but he knew pushing too hard might close Elijah off completely. So he changed tactics, asking the only question he knew wouldn't be answered with a polite, evasive, "Fine. What do you like to do for fun, Elijah?" Blake asked. Elijah stiffened again, his shoulders pulling inward as if the question had taken him off guard. His fingers twitched at the granola bar, but he didn't look up. "I don't know," he muttered after a long pause. "I don't really do anything." Blake smiled gently. "You don't have to have a big hobby to be a kid. What do you do after school?" "I just go home," Elijah said quickly. "Watch TV, homework. Nothing special." Blake studied him for a moment. Something about Elijah's words didn't sit right. The boy's life seemed empty, even when he was talking about what should have been the easiest part of his day. Something was missing. "Is your mom home when you get back?" Blake asked carefully. Elijah's eyes flickered, and for the first time, he seemed to hesitate. "No. She works late. I usually just wait for her to come home." Blake didn't miss the shift in the boy's demeanor, the subtle way his posture closed in on itself. "Does she ever get a chance to talk to you about your day?" Blake pressed gently. Or do you mostly just take care of things yourself?" Elijah's lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't answer right away, but Blake saw the way his fingers gripped the edge of the table, the tension that ran through his body. "It's fine," Elijah finally muttered. "I'm fine." Blake sat back, giving the boy some space. He could see that Elijah wasn't ready to share more, but he also knew there was more under the surface. Much more. The lunch ended quietly, with Blake offering a final, "Thanks for coming to talk, Elijah. I'm here if you need anything." The boy nodded, his eyes lingering on Blake for a moment before he stood and left the office. As Elijah walked out of the door, Blake couldn't shake the feeling that the boy's silence spoke volumes. There was something heavy hanging over him, something he wasn't ready to share. Blake sat at his desk, deep in thought. Elijah wasn't like the other kids he'd dealt with over the years. There was something about him, something broken, something unfinished. And Blake couldn't ignore it. This was just the beginning. He was going to get to the bottom of Elijah's story, whether the boy liked it or not. The days following his lunch with Elijah were a blur of meetings, reports, and the usual humdrum of school life. But no matter how hard Principal Blake tried to focus on the tasks at hand, his mind kept returning to the quiet seventh grader. He could not shake the feeling that something wasn't right, that Elijah was carrying a burden far heavier than any kid should have to bear. Blake kept his promise to himself to check in on Elijah, but the boy remained as distant as ever. At school, he was a shadow in the hallways, slipping from one classroom to the next, his face a mask of indifference. He was always polite when spoken to, but the usual enthusiasm or warmth that other students had seemed to be absent from Elijah's world. Each time Blake tried to reach out, each time he asked the boy a question or made an effort to talk, he was met with an uncomfortable silence. Elijah was polite, but closed off, not offering any more than he had during their brief lunch. Blake wasn't the type of man who gave up easily. If anything, his instincts as a principal had been honed by years of seeing through the mask students wore. He knew Elijah was hiding something, and it wasn't just a minor issue, it was something deep, something serious. One afternoon, as Blake was walking through the school courtyard on his way to his office, he noticed Elijah sitting alone on a bench near the back of the playground. The boy had his head down, his back slumped as if he were trying to make himself invisible. The laughter of the other students filled the air, but Elijah was detached, as if he were in a world of his own. Blake hesitated for a moment, his feet almost moving on their own as if the pull of something unsaid was drawing him closer. He didn't know what he was going to say, or if Elijah even wanted to talk. But something told him that now was the time. He approached slowly, careful not to startle the boy. When he reached the bench, he stood there for a second, watching Elijah's face as he sat silently, his shoulders hunched forward, lost in his thoughts. "Elijah," Blake said softly, sitting down next to him on the bench. Elijah didn't immediately respond, his gaze still fixed on the ground. Blake could hear the sound of the playground behind them, kids shouting, running around, but it all felt distant, like they were in their own separate world. "How are you doing today?" Blake asked, trying to keep his voice casual, not wanting to push too hard. Elijah finally looked up, his eyes briefly meeting Blake's before quickly darting away. "I'm fine." Blake nodded, though he knew the answer wasn't true. He could feel it in the tense air surrounding Elijah. This wasn't the answer of a kid who was fine. "Elijah," Blake said again, his voice soft but firm. "I want you to know something. You don't have to keep everything to yourself. If you're struggling, if something's going on, you don't have to go through it alone. We can talk, okay?" The boy was silent for a long moment, his hands tightly gripping the edges of his jeans as if he were holding himself together by sheer force. Blake wasn't sure whether Elijah would speak at all, but then, finally, the boy looked at him, and there was a flicker of something, fear, sadness, or maybe even relief, in his eyes. I don't know how to talk about it," Elijah muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's hard." Blake's heart tightened. He didn't push further right away, he simply gave the boy space, sitting beside him quietly. After a moment, Blake spoke again, his voice gentle. "Whatever it is, you don't have to hide it. You don't have to carry it all on your own," Blake said. "I'm here to listen. And I'm not going to judge you. I just want to help." Elijah swallowed hard, his throat bobbing as he fought back the emotion that was clearly threatening to rise to the surface. Blake had seen this before in his career, the quiet strength that kids like Elijah had, trying to shield themselves from the pain, thinking it was easier to bear it in silence than to speak it out loud. The moments stretched on, and Blake was starting to wonder if he had said too much, if he had pressed too hard when Elijah finally spoke again. "My mom, she works all the time. She's not really home. And when she is, she's tired. Really tired. She doesn't have time for me or my sister," Elijah said, his voice cracking slightly. "I'm supposed to be the one who takes care of everything. I'm the oldest. I make sure we have food, I help my sister with her homework. But sometimes it feels like it's too much." Blake's chest tightened as Elijah's words hung in the air between them. The weight of what the boy had just shared was almost unbearable. No child, especially one as young as Elijah, should have to bear such a responsibility. "I didn't ask for all this," Elijah continued, his voice shaky. "I didn't ask to be the one to take care of everything. But I don't know what else to do." Blake listened carefully, his heart aching for the boy. This wasn't just about being a quiet student or a kid who didn't fit in. Elijah was trying to fill a role that was far too big for him, trying to be the parent when he was still just a child himself. "I'm sorry, Elijah," Blake said softly. "You shouldn't have to do this on your own." The boy nodded, but the sorrow in his eyes told Blake that the pain ran deeper than just the responsibilities of taking care of his family. There was more, things Elijah wasn't ready to share yet. But Blake could tell that this was the first time Elijah had spoken openly about what was really going on at home. It was a small crack in the wall, and Blake wasn't going to let it close without offering his support. "I can't make everything better for you, Elijah," Blake said, his voice steady, "but I can help. We can find a way to make things easier." Elijah's eyes met Blake's then, a flicker of something, hope, there for just a second. But it was quickly replaced by the familiar guarded look. "I'll be okay," Elijah said, standing up from the bench. "I just need to go." Blake nodded, though his heart ached to see the boy retreat back into his shell. But he understood. Talking about something this painful wasn't easy, and Blake wasn't going to force Elijah to open up more than he was willing to. "Remember, Elijah," Blake said as the boy turned to walk away. "You don't have to go through this alone." Elijah gave a brief nod, but didn't say another word before he walked off, disappearing into the crowd of students. Blake watched him go, knowing this wasn't the end of the conversation. It was just the beginning. And he would be there, whenever Elijah was ready to talk again. The week that followed Elijah's quiet confession was filled with a strange mix of hope and uncertainty. Blake could sense that the walls around the boy's heart were beginning to crack, but they weren't ready to come down completely. The boy still avoided deeper conversations, but every once in a while, Blake would catch him glancing at him with something resembling trust in his eyes. It was a fragile thing, like the first hint of sunlight after a long storm. Blake knew it would take time. He couldn't rush Elijah, couldn't force him to share what he wasn't ready to say. The more Blake thought about it, the more he realized just how deep the boy's struggles went. It wasn't just the weight of responsibility that Elijah had taken on, there was something else. Something that Elijah wasn't telling him, something darker. It was late one Thursday afternoon when Blake decided to drop by the school library to check on Elijah again. His instinct told him that something was brewing, something that wasn't going to be solved in a quick chat after class. Elijah had seemed restless the last time they'd spoken, like there was more swirling beneath the surface. Blake knew that the library was a quiet, safe place for many students. If Elijah were hiding away, avoiding the noise of the cafeteria or the chaos of the hallways, it made sense he'd be there. Blake wasn't entirely sure what he'd do if he found Elijah in the same spot as before, but his gut told him it was worth the chance. As he walked down the familiar hallway toward the library, Blake was struck by how peaceful the school was at this hour. The noise of the school day had quieted, the bustling students all having gone home, leaving behind an empty and serene atmosphere. Blake could almost hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead as he approached the library doors. He pushed them open softly and stepped inside. The library, with its rows of neatly organized books, had a certain stillness about it. It was the kind of place where time seemed to slow down. Blake looked around, and at first, there was no sign of Elijah. The library was empty, save for a few students finishing their work in silence. But then he spotted him. Elijah was seated in the far corner, hunched over a desk with his arms crossed on top of the table. His face was buried in his sleeves, and his body seemed rigid, as if he were trying to shrink into himself. His presence was almost invisible in the dim light, and for a moment, Blake hesitated, unsure whether to approach. But then, the soft sound of sniffling reached his ears, and Blake's heart sank. Without thinking, Blake made his way over to Elijah's table, his steps quiet as he neared the boy. Elijah didn't look up. The only movement was the subtle rise and fall of his shoulders, his breaths uneven. Blake could feel the weight of the silence between them, thick and heavy. "Elijah?" Blake said gently, his voice low so as not to startle him. The boy's shoulders stiffened at the sound of his name, but he didn't move or raise his head. Blake waited a moment, giving Elijah space to acknowledge him if he wanted to. Finally, Elijah spoke, his voice cracked and strained. "I'm fine, Mr. Blake. You don't need to check on me." Blake could hear the rawness in the boy's voice, the pain just beneath the surface. He knew Elijah wasn't fine, not at all. But there was something in the boy's words, something that told Blake Elijah wasn't ready to confront whatever it was that hurt so much. "You don't have to pretend, Elijah," Blake said softly, his voice warm with understanding. "You don't have to go through this by yourself." There was a long silence, and Blake wasn't sure if Elijah would say anything more. But then, after what seemed like an eternity, Elijah finally lifted his head, and for the first time in weeks, Blake saw something in his eyes that wasn't just guarded or distant. It was vulnerability. Elijah's eyes were red from crying, his cheeks streaked with the remnants of tears. His gaze was distant, like he was looking through Blake rather than at him. But when their eyes met, there was no hiding the depth of the pain that Elijah carried with him. "I can't do it anymore, Mr. Blake," Elijah whispered, his voice so small it barely carried through the space between them. "I can't keep pretending everything's okay." Blake sat down across from him, careful to give the boy space, not crowding him. He didn't push Elijah to speak, he just waited, letting the silence hang between them, a quiet invitation. Elijah's breath hitched, and then, with no warning, he began to speak. The words tumbled out like a dam breaking. "It's my mom," he said, his voice trembling. She's been getting worse. She's always tired, always sick. She's not the same anymore. And my little sister, she doesn't know what's going on. She's too young to understand, but she knows something's wrong. She keeps asking why mom won't play with her, why she's always in bed." Blake could feel the weight of Elijah's words sinking in. His heart ached for the boy. Elijah wasn't just a lonely kid trying to make it through a tough situation, he was watching his mother deteriorate, unable to do anything to stop it. He was shouldering that burden alone. "Is she getting help?" Blake asked gently, his voice steady but full of concern. Elijah shook his head, his face crumpling in pain. "No. She won't go to the doctor. She says it's nothing. But I can see it. It's like, she's fading away, and I don't know how to help her. I'm only 12, Mr. Blake. I don't know how to fix this." Blake felt a lump form in his throat. No 12-year-old should ever have to feel the weight of the world on their shoulders like Elijah did. "You're doing the best you can, Elijah," Blake said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know it's hard, and I know it feels like too much. But you don't have to carry it all by yourself." Elijah didn't say anything for a long time. He just sat there, his head down, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Blake didn't try to stop him, he just sat there, watching, waiting, offering what little comfort he could. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Elijah lifted his head again, his eyes filled with unshed tears. "I don't know what to do anymore," Elijah whispered. "I just want everything to go back to normal. I want my mom to be okay. I don't want to feel so alone." Blake reached across the table, placing a hand on Elijah's. "You don't have to go through this alone, Elijah. Not anymore. You have people who care about you. People who want to help." Elijah's eyes flickered with something, hope, maybe, but it was still so fragile. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but at least now, Elijah had someone in his corner. After that afternoon in the library, Blake found himself with a renewed sense of purpose. Elijah had opened up, and although it had been painful, it was the first step toward finding a way to help him. Blake knew he couldn't solve all of Elijah's problems in one conversation, but he also knew he couldn't sit idly by. There were resources, there were people, and there were steps that could be taken to make things better, for Elijah, for his sister, and for their family. The very next day, Blake took action. He couldn't erase the weight on Elijah's shoulders, but maybe, just maybe, he could help take some of it off. That morning, Blake found himself walking through the halls of the school, moving with a sense of urgency. The students were busy with their usual routines, but his mind was elsewhere. As principal, Blake had access to the school's counseling services, and he was determined to get them involved. The school's counselor, Mrs. Harper, was an experienced professional. She had dealt with troubled students before, and Blake trusted her implicitly. She had an empathetic way of approaching difficult situations, something that was necessary when dealing with students like Elijah. Blake entered Mrs. Harper's office, and she looked up from the papers on her desk, her expression neutral but welcoming. She had a way of making people feel like they could talk about anything, like they were safe in her presence. She smiled when she saw Blake and motioned for him to sit down. "Good morning, Mr. Blake," she greeted him. "What brings you by today?" Blake hesitated for a moment, but then he plunged straight into it. "I need your help with a student. A 7th grader, Elijah Brooks." Mrs. Harper raised her eyebrows slightly but didn't interrupt. She had worked with Blake long enough to know that he didn't bring up students unless there was a real concern. "What's going on with Elijah?" she asked gently. Blake took a deep breath before continuing. "I've been keeping an eye on him for a while. He's always been quiet, but lately, he's been withdrawn, and I found him in the library yesterday, crying. I had a conversation with him, and it turns out his mother is seriously ill. She's not getting the medical help she needs, and Elijah is carrying the weight of taking care of her and his little sister." Mrs. Harper's expression shifted, her eyes softening with concern. "That's a heavy burden for someone so young. Have you spoken to him about other resources? About how we can support him?" Blake nodded. "He's opened up to me, but he's still not ready to ask for help. He doesn't want anyone to think he's weak, I think. But I believe if we approach this carefully, we can help him." Mrs. Harper thought for a moment before responding. "I'll reach out to Elijah. We can provide him with some emotional support, maybe even talk about family counseling. But we also need to involve Child Protective Services. If his mother isn't getting medical attention, it's a serious issue. Elijah shouldn't be responsible for managing everything on his own." Blake's stomach tightened at the mention of Child Protective Services. He hated the thought of disrupting Elijah's life even more, but he knew it was necessary for the boy's well-being. "I know. I don't want to make things worse, but I also don't want to stand by while he suffers." Mrs. Harper nodded, understanding the delicate balance they were walking. "I'll start making the calls. But we'll have to move carefully. Elijah needs to feel like he's in control of this, even though it's not in his hands. It's about supporting him without overwhelming him." Blake exhaled slowly, feeling a mix of relief and anxiety. The path forward was unclear, but it was a start. "I'll keep talking to him. I just need to make sure he knows we're here for him. And I'll keep an eye on his sister, too." After their discussion, Blake left Mrs. Harper's office with a clearer plan in mind. He wasn't sure how Elijah would react to the help that was being put in place, but he knew it was the right thing to do. It was important to let Elijah know that he didn't have to face this alone, that there were people willing to step in and fight for him and his family. That afternoon, after school had ended, Blake went back to the library to check on Elijah. The boy had become a sort of shadow in his mind, and Blake couldn't ignore him now. The library was quiet as usual, with only a few students scattered around, reading or finishing up their work. But there, in the corner where Blake had found him the day before, was Elijah. This time, the boy wasn't hunched over, his arms wrapped around himself. Instead, he was sitting up straight, his face thoughtful, almost lost in his own thoughts. Blake approached him slowly, making sure not to surprise him. "Elijah," Blake called softly, and the boy looked up, meeting his gaze. "Mr. Blake," Elijah greeted him in a subdued tone, offering a small, hesitant smile. Blake returned the smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. He could see the exhaustion still hanging over Elijah, the emotional toll visible in the subtle tightness of his jaw and the slight dullness in his eyes. "I just wanted to check in on you," Blake said, taking a seat across from him. "How are you doing?" Elijah didn't respond right away. Instead, he gazed out the library windows, the early evening light casting long shadows across the room. Finally, after a long pause, Elijah spoke, his voice quiet but steady. "I'm trying," he said simply, but there was a weight to the words, a sense of determination. "I'm doing the best I can." Blake nodded, respecting the boy's strength. "You're doing more than your fair share, Elijah. But you don't have to do it alone." Elijah turned his head slightly, meeting Blake's eyes again, his expression unreadable. Blake leaned forward slightly, his voice gentle but firm. "I've spoken to someone who can help. There are people who can support you and your family. We can get your mom the help she needs, and we can make sure you're not carrying this burden by yourself anymore." Elijah's face tightened for a moment, as if he were about to protest. But then, after a long beat, he lowered his head, his shoulders slumping in resignation. "I don't want to lose her," Elijah whispered, his voice barely audible. I can't lose my mom." Blake felt a lump form in his throat. The boy's fear was raw, and Blake could see just how much Elijah had been carrying on his own. He reached across the table and placed a hand on Elijah's. "You won't lose her, Elijah," Blake reassured him, his voice steady and sure. "We'll make sure she gets the help she needs. And you won't have to carry this alone anymore. I promise." Elijah's eyes welled up, but he didn't let the tears fall. He just nodded, his hand gripping Blake's for a moment before pulling away. For the first time, there was a glimmer of hope in Elijah's eyes. It was small, fragile, but it was there. The next few days at school passed in a blur for Blake. Between meetings, emails, and his usual responsibilities, his mind often drifted back to Elijah. He knew the boy was still wrestling with his emotions, still processing everything that had been said. Blake had done his best to create a space for Elijah to feel safe, but there was only so much he could do. The real work, the real change, needed to come from outside of school. It needed to come from home, from Elijah's mother. Blake had reached out to Mrs. Harper, and together they had discussed the best course of action. It was clear that Elijah's situation wasn't something that could be solved overnight, but it was also clear that the longer they waited, the more the situation would spiral out of control. With a heavy heart, Blake knew that the only way to truly help Elijah was to speak to his mother directly. It wasn't a conversation he wanted to have, but it was one that had to happen. That Thursday afternoon, Blake drove to Elijah's house after school. He'd arranged to meet with Mrs. Brooks, Elijah's mother, in the hope of understanding the full scope of the situation. Blake had done his best to prepare himself mentally. He knew that the woman who had raised Elijah was likely overwhelmed and in denial about how bad things had gotten. But that didn't change the fact that Elijah was suffering, and his family needed help. Blake arrived at the small, modest house on the edge of town. It was a quiet neighborhood, with houses spaced a little too far apart for real community, but close enough to suggest that people still cared. As Blake parked in front of the house, he noticed the faded paint on the porch and the overgrown bushes in the front yard. It wasn't a bad neighborhood, but it clearly wasn't well taken care of, either. He walked up to the door and knocked. It took a moment before he heard footsteps approaching, and then the door opened slowly. Mrs. Brooks stood in the doorway, looking surprised but not entirely unfazed. She was a middle-aged woman, with a tired face and dark circles under her eyes. She didn't look sick, not in the way Elijah had described, but there was something about her posture, slumped shoulders, a distant gaze, that told Blake something wasn't right. "Mr. Blake," she said, her voice soft but tinged with wariness. "I didn't expect a visit. Is something wrong?" Blake took a deep breath. "I hope not. I've come to talk to you about Elijah." Her expression shifted at the mention of her son. She stepped back slightly, holding the door in one hand as if she might close it at any moment. Blake was careful to keep his tone calm and non-accusatory. "Is everything okay?" Blake asked. "Elijah's been struggling at school lately. I've noticed he's been quiet, withdrawn. And when I spoke to him, he told me some things about his mom being ill. I think he's been carrying a lot of weight on his own." Mrs. Brooks's face tightened, but she didn't speak immediately. Blake took this as a sign to keep going. "I know it's not easy, and I don't mean to intrude," he continued. "But Elijah's health, his mental health, I mean, is just as important as his physical health. I want to help him. I want to make sure he's okay. And I think, if you're open to it, there's support available for your family." Mrs. Brooks hesitated, her eyes flickering with something Blake couldn't quite read. She finally nodded, but the motion seemed reluctant. "Come inside," she said quietly. "I'll make us some tea." Blake followed her into the small living room, which was sparsely decorated. There were toys scattered on the floor, signs of Elijah's younger sister's presence, and the television was on low, playing some old sitcom reruns. It felt quiet, too quiet, and Blake could see that the place hadn't been kept up like it should have been. There was a heaviness in the air that made Blake's chest tighten. Mrs. Brooks sat down on the couch, and Blake took a seat across from her. She busied herself with preparing the tea, her hands trembling slightly as she set about the task. Blake couldn't help but notice how tired she looked, how much the weight of her responsibilities had worn her down. After a few moments, she turned to face him, her expression guarded. "I don't know what you think you can do, Mr. Blake," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I've been dealing with this illness for months now. It's not something that can be fixed. I've tried to get help, but it's complicated. My insurance doesn't cover it, and I don't have the time or money to do anything more." Blake nodded, understanding the frustration in her voice. He knew how difficult the healthcare system could be, how out of reach resources sometimes seemed. But this wasn't just about the physical illness. This was about Elijah, her son, and the toll it was taking on him, mentally and emotionally. "I understand that," Blake said gently. "But Elijah needs more than just physical care. He's watching you struggle, and it's affecting him. He's only 12, Mrs. Brooks. He shouldn't have to take care of you and his sister. He needs to be a kid, to have people who can help him carry the weight." Mrs. Brooks's face softened slightly, though she still seemed defensive. "I know he's been worried. I've seen how he's been acting. But I don't know what to do. I don't have the energy to be what he needs me to be right now." Blake's heart broke for her. She wasn't being negligent. She wasn't abandoning her children. But she was overwhelmed, and sometimes that made it impossible to see what needed to be done. "There are resources, Mrs. Brooks. Elijah doesn't have to do this alone," Blake said. "I've spoken with the school counselor, and we can get Elijah the support he needs. There are programs that can help you, too, things like home healthcare or assistance with medical bills. We can reach out to social services for you if you're willing." Mrs. Brooks looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting nervously. "I don't want anyone thinking I can't take care of my kids," she whispered. "I've always been there for them. I don't want to lose my pride." Blake gently placed a hand on the table, a silent gesture of reassurance. "You're not losing your pride, Mrs. Brooks. You're doing the best you can. But Elijah can't carry this on his own. And neither can you." There was a long silence between them. Mrs. Brooks seemed lost in thought, her gaze distant as if she were trying to reconcile everything Blake was telling her with what she knew in her heart. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she sighed. "Okay. I'll consider it. I don't want Elijah to go through this alone. I'll talk to him. I'll try." Blake nodded, offering a small but sincere smile. "That's all we can ask for, Mrs. Brooks. Take it one step at a time. We'll be here to help." As he left her house that evening, Blake felt a glimmer of hope. It was a small step, but it was progress. Elijah's mother wasn't ready to ask for everything she needed just yet, but at least she was open to it. And that, Blake knew, was the first step in making things better for Elijah. The next morning, Blake arrived at school with a sense of cautious optimism. Mrs. Brooks had agreed to consider the help he'd offered, and while Blake knew that getting Elijah's mother to accept full support wouldn't be easy, the conversation had taken a positive turn. But now, the most important step was to reach out to Elijah, to let him know that there was a plan in place to help him and his family. Blake wasn't sure how Elijah would react to the news. The boy had been holding on to a great deal of pain and responsibility for so long, and Blake had no illusion that telling him about the resources available would immediately lift the burden. But it was a start. It was hope, a hope that, if nurtured, might grow into something that could truly change Elijah's life. As the school day began, Blake made his way to the library once again. He'd told Elijah he would check in with him, and the library was a familiar, quiet place where Blake knew he could have a private conversation. The soft hum of voices and the rustling of pages filled the air as Blake approached the entrance. He scanned the room briefly and spotted Elijah sitting in the corner, his usual spot. Elijah's head was bent over a book, but Blake noticed that his posture was slouched, his usual sharp focus replaced with a vague, distracted air. Blake had to wonder if the weight of everything going on at home was starting to catch up with him. Blake walked over, but instead of speaking immediately, he stood there for a moment, observing the boy. Elijah had become a puzzle Blake couldn't quite solve. He was strong, so strong, for someone so young, but Blake had seen the cracks in that facade. "Elijah," Blake said softly, pulling the boy from his thoughts. The boy looked up slowly, his expression guarded. "Hey, Mr. Blake," he replied, his voice betraying none of the emotion that Blake knew was buried just beneath the surface. Blake sat down across from him, placing a hand on the table as he spoke. "I wanted to check in with you, Elijah. See how you're doing." Elijah's eyes flickered toward the table, his fingers tracing the edge of the book in front of him, but he didn't respond right away. Blake wasn't expecting much, but he needed to be patient. "I talked to your mom yesterday," Blake continued, his voice gentle. "We had a long conversation. She's agreed to consider getting some help, both for herself and for your family." Elijah's gaze snapped up at that. His eyes were wide, his expression a mix of confusion and disbelief. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Blake nodded, understanding the confusion in the boy's voice. It was a lot to process, especially for someone who had always felt like they had to deal with everything alone. "I spoke with Mrs. Brooks about some resources. There are ways to get help with the medical care your mom needs. There are also services that can support you, people who can help with what you're going through." Elijah shook his head, his brow furrowing as if he couldn't wrap his mind around the idea. "But, she doesn't have money for that stuff. I've told you before. She can't afford any of it." "I know, Elijah," Blake said softly. "And that's why we're here. There are programs, there's financial aid, and there are people who want to help. You don't have to take care of everything by yourself." Elijah pulled his book closer to his chest, as if he were trying to hold on to something tangible to ground him. "I'm used to it. I don't need anyone else to do it for me. I've been fine." Blake could hear the frustration in Elijah's voice, the pride that was still too strong to allow him to accept help. Blake leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady. "Elijah, I understand. I know you're strong, but even the strongest people need help sometimes. It's okay to ask for help." The words seemed to hang in the air between them. Elijah didn't look up immediately, his eyes focused intently on the pages of his book as if trying to disappear into the pages. After a long moment, Blake tried again, softer this time. "You don't have to face this alone, Elijah. You never have to carry everything by yourself. It's okay to let people help." For a moment, there was only silence, and Blake was beginning to wonder if Elijah was going to say anything at all when the boy finally spoke. His voice was quiet, barely above a whisper, but it was enough to break through the silence. "I just don't want anyone to think I'm weak," Elijah murmured, his eyes never leaving the table. Blake's heart ached as he listened to the words. The fear of being seen as weak was something Elijah had internalized deeply. It wasn't just about taking care of his mom or his sister. It was about protecting his own sense of self-worth, about keeping up appearances that everything was fine when, in reality, it was far from it. "You're not weak, Elijah," Blake said, his voice firm but kind. "Asking for help doesn't make you weak. It makes you brave. It shows strength. It shows that you're willing to fight for yourself and the people you care about. And that's something to be proud of." Elijah looked up then, and for the first time, there was a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. It was small, but it was there. Blake could see the walls around Elijah beginning to crack, just a little. The boy shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with the emotions he was feeling, but he didn't look away. "What if I can't fix everything?" he asked, his voice thick with the weight of the question. Blake paused, taking in the boy's words. "You don't have to fix everything, Elijah. You don't have to be the one who makes everything better. But you do need to take care of yourself. You're important too." Elijah swallowed hard, his fingers still gripping the book tightly. "I don't know if I can do this," he whispered. Blake gave a reassuring smile, a warm and genuine one, and placed a hand gently on the table. "You don't have to do it all at once. It's one step at a time. We'll take this one day at a time, and we'll get you the support you need. You're not alone in this." For the first time in what felt like forever, Blake saw a shift in Elijah. The boy wasn't ready to open up fully, but he was starting to see that maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward that didn't involve carrying everything on his own. It was a small step, a baby step, but it was progress. Blake stood up, ready to give Elijah the space he needed. "I'm here for you, Elijah. Anytime you need to talk, I'll be here." Elijah didn't say anything at first, but as Blake turned to leave, the boy spoke quietly, almost as if testing the waters. "Thanks," he said, his voice barely audible. Blake smiled, knowing that the road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time, he believed that Elijah might just be ready to walk it. The following week, Blake kept his promise to Elijah, and the boy's trust seemed to be growing, albeit slowly. The walls that had once been so firm around Elijah were now cracked open just a little more with each passing day. There was a shift in the way he responded, less defensive, more open to the idea of being helped. But there was still that palpable tension in his eyes when the conversation turned to his family and the weight of responsibility he carried. Blake knew Elijah wasn't ready to dive deep into his emotions yet, but he also knew that the next step was crucial. The boy needed support beyond just what Blake could offer. He needed professional help, someone who could guide him through the difficult emotions he was facing and provide him with the tools to cope with his family's situation. Blake had already arranged for Elijah to meet with Mrs. Lee, the school counselor. She was a warm, compassionate woman who had helped many students navigate their personal struggles. Elijah had been reluctant at first. The idea of sitting down with a stranger to discuss his feelings didn't sit well with him. But after Blake's gentle encouragement, he had agreed to give it a try. On the morning of the meeting, Blake found Elijah sitting at the back of the cafeteria, his head down as he picked at his breakfast. His usual energy was absent, replaced by the same quiet unease that had been lingering in the boy ever since their first conversation. "Hey, Elijah," Blake said as he approached, his voice light but calm. The boy looked up at him, giving a half-hearted smile. "Hey, Mr. Blake," he replied. Blake took a seat beside him, giving him a moment to finish chewing before speaking again. "How are you feeling about meeting with Mrs. Lee today?" Elijah shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his fingers nervously tapping against the table. "I don't know," he muttered. "I don't like talking about stuff like that. I mean, what's the point, right? She's not going to understand." Blake nodded, understanding the apprehension. "I get it. Talking about things like this isn't easy, but sometimes it helps to have someone to listen. Mrs. Lee's been doing this for a long time, and she's really good at helping kids who are going through tough stuff. She's not going to judge you, Elijah. She's just there to help you figure things out." Elijah didn't say anything for a moment. He stared at his tray, as if weighing Blake's words. Finally, he gave a small nod. "I guess. I'll try." Blake smiled. "That's all I'm asking. You don't have to figure everything out right away. Just take it one step at a time." Elijah looked up at Blake then, his eyes still guarded but a little more trusting. "Thanks, for pushing me," he said quietly. Blake's heart warmed at the boy's words. It wasn't easy for Elijah to admit when he needed help, but that small acknowledgement meant more than Blake could put into words. "You don't have to thank me, Elijah. You're doing the hard work. You're the one who's being brave by even showing up." With that, they both stood up, and Blake led Elijah to the counseling office. As they walked through the halls, Blake noticed how stiffly Elijah was holding himself, as if every step was an effort. He could sense that the boy was still conflicted, torn between wanting to be strong and the fear of being vulnerable. When they arrived at Mrs. Lee's office, Blake gave Elijah a reassuring smile. "You got this, kid," he said softly, trying to offer a final bit of encouragement before he left. Elijah didn't respond, but Blake saw the slight nod of his head, a sign that he was preparing himself, even if he didn't feel ready. Blake's heart tightened as he watched the boy disappear into the counselor's office. He knew this was only the beginning of a long journey, but at least Elijah was starting to take the steps in the right direction. Mrs. Lee's office was a small, cozy space, soft lighting, comfortable chairs, and a few potted plants on the windowsill. It was warm, inviting, and completely unlike the cold, institutional feel of many school offices. Blake had always admired Mrs. Lee's ability to create an atmosphere where students felt safe. Mrs. Lee herself was a woman in her late 40s, with a calm demeanor and a soft, reassuring voice. She had a way of making even the most anxious students feel like they weren't alone in their struggles. Blake had often spoken highly of her to other teachers and students, and he was confident that she could help Elijah, even if the road ahead seemed uncertain. As Elijah stepped into the room, Mrs. Lee stood up from her desk and greeted him with a warm smile. "Hi, Elijah. It's so nice to meet you," she said in a voice that was both gentle and inviting. Elijah hesitated for a moment, standing just inside the door, his body rigid. But then, almost imperceptibly, he relaxed a little. "Hi," he muttered, his gaze flickering around the room but never quite landing on Mrs. Lee's face. "I know this might feel a little strange at first," Mrs. Lee said, sensing Elijah's discomfort. "But I promise, there's no pressure here. We can take it slow, and you can share whatever you're comfortable with." Elijah didn't respond right away. He simply walked to the chair in front of her desk and sat down, his body still stiff and tense. Mrs. Lee sat back down behind her desk and folded her hands gently in front of her. "How are you doing today, Elijah?" she asked softly. Elijah stared at his shoes for a long moment, his fingers twisting nervously in his lap. "I'm okay," he said, but the words didn't carry much weight. Mrs. Lee didn't push him. She let the silence linger, giving him time to find the words he needed. Eventually, Elijah's eyes flickered up to meet hers. "It's just, a lot," he said quietly. "There's a lot going on. I don't know how to talk about it." Mrs. Lee nodded, her expression sympathetic. "It's okay to feel that way, Elijah. Sometimes, just acknowledging that it's a lot is the first step toward feeling better. You don't have to have all the answers right now. We can just talk, and I'm here to listen." For the first time in a long while, Elijah didn't look away. Instead, he let his guard down just enough to admit what he'd been feeling, something Blake had known all along but Elijah hadn't been able to say. "I feel like I have to fix everything. For my mom. For my sister. But I don't know how," Elijah said, his voice catching slightly as the weight of his words seemed to sink in. Mrs. Lee's eyes softened, and she leaned forward slightly. "You don't have to fix everything, Elijah. It's okay to ask for help, and it's okay to take care of yourself too. You don't have to carry the world on your shoulders. Not by yourself." The words seemed to resonate with Elijah, who for the first time in a long time allowed himself to relax a little. It wasn't a breakthrough, yet, but it was a start. And in that moment, Blake felt a sense of hope. Elijah was beginning to open up, beginning to realize that it was okay to be vulnerable, that it was okay to ask for help. The next few days were quieter, but there was a distinct shift in Elijah's demeanor. He wasn't quite ready to share all of his emotions or his worries with everyone, but Blake could see the change. The conversations between them were no longer just about the weight of Elijah's struggles, there were small moments of lightness, small cracks in the wall Elijah had carefully built around himself. Blake knew it was a start, and he wasn't about to rush it. After his first session with Mrs. Lee, Elijah seemed to carry himself differently. He wasn't smiling, exactly, but there was a softness to him now, a slight openness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Blake took it as a sign that the boy was starting to trust, starting to believe that there might be a way out of the darkness that had surrounded him for so long. That Friday afternoon, Blake stood outside the school's main entrance, waiting for Elijah to finish his last class. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the campus. Blake had been thinking a lot about Elijah, about the way the boy was slowly letting people in, about how he was learning to accept that it was okay to be vulnerable. He hadn't solved all of Elijah's problems, but Blake knew he was on the right path. Sometimes, it was just about showing someone that they weren't alone, that they didn't have to face everything on their own. When Elijah finally emerged from the school, his backpack slung over one shoulder, he looked up at Blake. His expression was still somewhat guarded, but there was something different about him, less closed off, a little more open. "Hey," Blake greeted him with a smile. "How's it going?" Elijah hesitated for a moment before responding. "It's okay," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "I guess, things are starting to feel a little better." Blake raised an eyebrow. "A little better?" Elijah gave a small shrug, a fleeting hint of a smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah, I guess. Mrs. Lee, she's not as bad as I thought. I mean, she actually listens." Blake chuckled. "That's kind of her job, you know." Elijah shot him a half-smile, then looked down at the ground. "Yeah, I know. But I didn't expect it to feel, okay, I guess. Like, it didn't feel like I was being judged." Blake's heart lifted. He had hoped that Elijah would feel comfortable with Mrs. Lee, but hearing it from Elijah himself made all the difference. "I'm really glad to hear that," Blake said, his voice sincere. "It takes a lot to open up like that. I'm proud of you, Elijah." The boy didn't respond at first, but his shoulders seemed to relax just a little. There was a quiet pride in his eyes, as if the compliment had meant more than he was willing to admit. They began walking down the path toward the parking lot, and for the first time in a while, there was a sense of ease between them. The weight of the world still hung heavy over Elijah's shoulders, but the boy was carrying it differently now, not alone, not without any help. "I've been thinking," Elijah said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. Maybe I can try that program you were talking about. The one for my mom. And maybe for me too." Blake stopped walking for a moment, turning to face the boy. "Are you sure? It's a big step." Elijah nodded, a determination flashing in his eyes. "Yeah. I mean, if it can help her, then I'll try. I don't know if it'll fix everything, but maybe it'll make things a little better." Blake smiled, a feeling of relief flooding through him. It wasn't the answer he had expected, but it was the one Elijah needed to find on his own. It was progress, a sign that the boy was beginning to see that accepting help didn't mean he had failed. It meant he was strong enough to face what he couldn't do alone. "I think that's a great idea," Blake said, his voice filled with pride. "Taking that first step is the hardest part. I'll be here to support you through it." Elijah's gaze softened. "Thanks, Mr. Blake. Really. I didn't think I could get this far." Blake placed a hand on Elijah's shoulder, giving him a gentle squeeze. "You've done more than you realize. But the most important part is that you're not alone anymore." As they reached the parking lot, Elijah hesitated for a moment, then turned to Blake with a serious expression. "You think I can actually make things better?" he asked, his voice unsure. Blake looked the boy in the eyes, willing him to see the truth in his words. "I know you can," he said firmly. "It won't be easy, and it won't happen overnight, but you're stronger than you think. And with the right support, you and your family can get through this." Elijah's gaze lingered on Blake for a long moment, the boy seemingly weighing his words, before he gave a small, tentative nod. "Okay. I'll try." With that, Blake felt a surge of hope not just for Elijah, but for the possibility of a new beginning. It wasn't going to be perfect, and there were still many challenges ahead. But Blake could see it now. Elijah wasn't giving up. He wasn't going to carry the weight of the world alone anymore. As they parted ways, Blake watched Elijah walk toward his car, his steps a little lighter than usual, his posture a little straighter. Blake couldn't help but smile. There was still so much work to do, but today, there was a sense of peace, a sense of hope. Elijah was ready for a new beginning. And Blake was there, every step of the way. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The weeks that followed Elijah's decision to reach out for help were a mix of small victories and setbacks. It was clear to Blake that the boy was still struggling with the weight of his family's situation, but there were moments when Elijah seemed lighter, as if the burden wasn't quite as heavy anymore. Blake continued to check in with Elijah after school, offering words of encouragement when he needed them and giving him space when he didn't. Sometimes they would talk about how things were going at school, nothing heavy, just enough to show Elijah that he was cared for. Other times, they would sit together in silence, both of them feeling the comfort of just being there, without the pressure of needing to say anything at all. It wasn't until a Tuesday afternoon, just a few weeks after that pivotal conversation about reaching out for help, that Blake saw a change in Elijah. They had just finished a quick check-in after school, and Blake was about to say goodbye when Elijah hesitated by the door, looking as though he wanted to say something but wasn't sure how to put it into words. Blake gave him a warm, encouraging smile. "What's on your mind, Elijah?" The boy shifted on his feet, his fingers fidgeting with the strap of his backpack. He looked hesitant, but then something in his eyes softened, as if he had made a decision. I think I'm ready to talk about it. About what's been going on." Blake's heart skipped a beat. He had been waiting for Elijah to reach this point, but hearing the words spoken out loud still felt like a milestone. "You sure?" he asked, keeping his voice gentle. "You don't have to, you know. But if you're ready, I'm here to listen." Elijah nodded, his shoulders stiff, but his eyes were earnest. "I want to. I've been thinking about it a lot, and I know it's not just gonna go away if I don't talk about it." Blake's chest tightened with a mixture of pride and empathy. He stepped aside, motioning for Elijah to take a seat on the bench by the window. It wasn't a perfect moment, but it was the moment Elijah had chosen to step forward. Blake sat beside him, waiting patiently for Elijah to continue. For a long while, there was silence. Elijah stared out the window, his hands clasped tightly together in his lap. Blake didn't rush him. Sometimes, silence was the space that allowed the hardest things to be said. After a few minutes, Elijah took a deep breath, then spoke in a low, steady voice. "It's my mom," he began, his words slow but deliberate. "She's always been there for me and my sister. She works 2 jobs, and I don't know how she does it. But lately, I can see it's been too much for her. She's always tired, and sometimes she gets angry. Not at us, but at everything else. At life, I guess. I don't know. It's like she's just giving up on herself, and I don't know what to do about it." Blake listened intently, his heart aching for the boy. He had suspected that Elijah's mom was struggling, but hearing it from Elijah himself brought it into sharp focus. It was clear now that Elijah was carrying not just the weight of his own fears, but also the burden of trying to fix something that wasn't his to fix. "She's always telling me that we'll be okay, but I don't think she believes it anymore," Elijah continued, his voice breaking slightly. "I see her crying sometimes, when she thinks no one's watching. And it makes me feel so helpless, Mr. Blake. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to help her." Blake could feel the tension radiating off Elijah. The boy's hands were trembling slightly now, his words growing more frantic. But there was something about Elijah's honesty in this moment that struck Blake to the core. Elijah wasn't just talking about his own struggles, he was talking about his love and concern for his mom, his desperate need to help her even when he didn't know how. "Have you told her how you feel?" Blake asked gently, his tone soft but encouraging. Elijah shook his head, his eyes welling up with tears. "No. I can't. I don't want to make it worse. I don't know how she'd take it. I don't even know if she'd care. I think she might be ashamed that she's not enough for us anymore." Blake felt a pang of sorrow in his chest. Elijah's fear of burdening his mother with his own emotions spoke volumes about the immense responsibility the boy felt at such a young age. He didn't want to add to her struggles, but in doing so, he was holding everything inside, letting it eat away at him. Blake knew it was time to give Elijah some perspective. "Elijah," he said softly, his voice full of understanding, "I know you're trying to protect her. But you don't have to carry this all by yourself. Your mom loves you. She may be struggling right now, but that doesn't make her a failure. And it definitely doesn't mean that you're not enough for her. You and your sister are the most important things in her life. But she's also human. She has her own battles, and that's okay. You're allowed to feel what you're feeling, and it's okay to talk to her about it. You're not burdening her. Sometimes, sharing the load can make it lighter." Elijah's eyes flickered with uncertainty, but Blake could see the wheels turning in his mind. For the first time in their conversation, there was a hint of hope, a tiny spark of realization that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to carry everything alone. "I don't know if I can do that," Elijah said quietly, but there was something different in his voice, a mixture of vulnerability and determination. "I don't know if she'll even listen. But, maybe I'll try." Blake placed a hand on Elijah's shoulder. "That's all I'm asking for. You don't have to figure it all out today. Just take it one step at a time. And I promise, you're not alone. You've got people who care about you and want to see you and your family get through this." Elijah nodded, wiping away the tears that had started to fall. He still looked uncertain, but there was a glimmer of courage in his eyes. The first real breakthrough, the first time Elijah had admitted how heavy his heart had become, and the first time he had allowed himself to see that it was okay to share that burden, had happened. And that was huge. As they stood up to leave, Blake felt a deep sense of pride for the boy. Elijah wasn't fixed. He wasn't completely healed. But for the first time, he was taking the first real steps toward dealing with his feelings. And that, Blake knew, was the beginning of a new chapter. The following week, Blake could sense that Elijah was wrestling with something deep inside. There were small moments when the boy would fidget during their conversations, his gaze turning distant, as if he were mentally replaying past conversations, or perhaps, considering the possibility of his next one. Blake had noticed that Elijah's eyes were a little darker, a little more intense these days. The breakthrough they'd had a few days ago was significant, but it was clear that Elijah wasn't ready to simply let go of the weight he'd been carrying for so long. It wasn't until Wednesday afternoon, after school, that Blake saw the culmination of Elijah's internal struggle. He was sitting in the teacher's lounge when his phone buzzed. It was a text from Elijah. "Can we talk after school today? I think I want to say something. I'm not sure if I can yet, but I need to try." Blake stared at the screen for a moment, the weight of those words sinking in. Elijah had always been guarded, distant, even when they'd first met. The fact that he was reaching out, asking for help in his own way, felt like another turning point. Blake immediately responded. "Of course, Elijah. I'm here. Whenever you're ready." As the end of the school day approached, Blake's heart beat just a little faster. He knew this conversation was going to be different from the ones they'd had before. This wasn't just about Elijah's mom, or the school, or the weight of his burdens, it was going to be about Elijah himself. About the things he had been hiding from the world for so long. Elijah arrived a little later than usual, his steps slower, his face more serious than Blake had ever seen it. There was a tension in the air as they met in the corner of the hallway, away from the bustling students. Elijah had his hands shoved deep into his hoodie pockets, and his head was slightly lowered. Blake noticed that his eyes were red, as if he hadn't gotten much sleep the night before. "Hey, Elijah," Blake greeted gently, his voice full of care. "You all right?" Elijah didn't immediately respond. Instead, he looked up at Blake with an expression that was a mixture of resolve and vulnerability. His lips were pressed into a thin line, and for a moment, he didn't seem like the same boy who had walked into Blake's office all those weeks ago. "Mr. Blake, I don't know how to say this, Elijah began, his voice thick with emotion. But I've been thinking a lot about what you said last time. About sharing the load, and how it's okay to not carry everything on my own. Blake nodded encouragingly, giving Elijah all the space he needed. You don't have to rush anything, Elijah. Just take your time. I keep thinking about my mom, Elijah said, his voice cracking just a little. And how I'm trying to protect her. But I'm also trying to protect myself from everything. From the hurt, from the pain I feel when I see her like this. And I guess, in trying to protect her, I've been trying to protect myself, too. Blake could feel the weight in Elijah's words. The boy wasn't just talking about his mom anymore, he was talking about himself, his own fears, his own insecurities. This was deeper than any conversation they'd had before, and Blake knew that this moment would define the path Elijah would take moving forward. You've been holding a lot of pain inside, haven't you? Blake asked, his voice calm but laced with understanding. Elijah's eyes welled up with tears as he nodded, his jaw tightening. Yeah. I've been pretending that I can handle it, that I can fix everything. But I can't. And it's been eating me up inside. I've been so scared of letting anyone see it, scared that if I show how broken I feel, everything will just fall apart. Blake felt a deep sorrow for Elijah, but he also felt a flicker of pride. The boy was finally acknowledging the depth of his pain. He was allowing himself to be vulnerable. And that, despite the hurt it caused him to feel, was a powerful step. I get it, Elijah, Blake said softly, his voice full of empathy. It's really hard to admit when we're not okay. And it's especially hard when you feel like everyone's depending on you to be strong. But you don't have to be strong all the time. You don't have to carry that burden by yourself anymore. You've already started letting people in. Elijah wiped at his eyes with the sleeve of his hoodie, trying to brush off the tears that had started to fall. He looked away for a moment, taking a deep breath before speaking again. It's just. I don't want to disappoint anyone. I don't want to be a burden. I feel like if I let this out, if I really admit to my mom and to myself how bad things have gotten, it'll just make everything worse. Blake could hear the fear in Elijah's voice, the fear of opening up, of allowing others to see his pain. It was a fear that many people, especially young people, carried deep inside themselves. But Blake knew that Elijah's fear wasn't just about the vulnerability, it was about the possibility that by admitting his struggles, he might lose control over everything. The thing is, Blake said carefully, you're not going to make things worse by being honest about how you feel. It's not weakness to admit that you're struggling. It's actually the bravest thing you can do. And when you share what's going on with the people you love, it might surprise you, sometimes, it can bring you closer, not drive you apart. Elijah's gaze flickered back to Blake, his eyes searching. For the first time in a long while, Blake could see a glimmer of hope in them, a willingness to trust, to believe that maybe, just maybe, opening up wouldn't make everything fall apart. I don't know if I can do it yet, Elijah said, his voice quieter, but the weight seemed just a little lighter. But I'll try. I think I can start with my mom. Maybe we can talk about it. Maybe she'll understand. Blake smiled, his heart swelling with pride. That's all I can ask, Elijah. You don't have to have all the answers. You just need to be honest with yourself and with her. And remember, you don't have to do it alone. You have people who care about you. I care about you. Elijah took a deep breath, his shoulders relaxing slightly. For the first time in their conversation, he looked a little lighter, like a weight had been lifted, even if just for a moment. Thanks, Mr. Blake, Elijah said, his voice full of quiet gratitude. I'll keep trying. I don't know what'll happen, but I'll try. Blake gave him an encouraging nod. I know you will. And I'll be here, no matter what. As they stood there, in the quiet hallway, Elijah's words hung in the air, a promise to himself, and a commitment to start sharing the load he had carried alone for so long. Blake knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but Elijah had made a choice. A choice to stop carrying the weight of the world by himself. And that, Blake thought, was the first step toward healing. Elijah's words that day lingered in Blake's mind. As much as he wanted to believe Elijah's resolve, he knew that opening up wasn't a switch that could be flipped. It wasn't something that could be fixed with a single conversation or moment of clarity. It would take time, patience, and most importantly, the courage to confront the things that Elijah had kept hidden for so long. The following days were quieter than usual. Elijah still showed up after school, still met with Blake in the same corner by the hallway, but there was something different in his demeanor. He wasn't withdrawn, but he wasn't quite as bright either. Blake could sense the internal tug-of-war that was happening inside Elijah, the battle between wanting to take the next step and the fear of what might happen when he did. Blake had heard nothing more from Elijah's mom. He knew the boy had been thinking about having that difficult conversation, but he also knew that for someone like Elijah, every word would carry the weight of 1,000 fears. The fear of disappointing his mom, the fear of being too vulnerable, and the fear of losing control. The next Thursday afternoon, Elijah arrived at Blake's office looking more anxious than ever. He stood at the door for a moment before stepping inside, hands shoved deep in the pockets of his jacket, head slightly down. Blake could see the storm inside him before Elijah even said a word. "Hey," Blake greeted gently, his tone light but full of care. "What's on your mind?" Elijah hesitated, his fingers nervously tapping the edge of the doorframe. I'm supposed to talk to my mom tonight," he said, his voice shaky. "I don't know if I can do it." Blake nodded, his heart heavy with empathy. He had been expecting this moment, but hearing the doubt in Elijah's voice made it all the more real. This was the moment of truth, the moment Elijah had to decide whether he would take that leap, however terrifying, or retreat back into the silence that had held him captive for so long. "Have you thought about what you want to say?" Blake asked quietly, giving Elijah space to answer at his own pace. Elijah looked up, his eyes flickering with fear and uncertainty. "I don't even know where to start. I don't know if I should just come out and say everything, or if I should, be more careful. What if I say something that makes it worse?" Blake leaned forward slightly, choosing his words with care. "There's no perfect way to do this, Elijah. It's not about having all the right words, it's about being honest. Just tell her what you're feeling. Tell her how much you care about her, and that you see what she's going through. Let her know that it's okay to talk about the hard stuff, and that you're there for her." Elijah swallowed hard, his throat tight. "But what if she gets angry? What if she thinks I'm blaming her?" Blake gave a soft, reassuring smile. "Elijah, sometimes when people are struggling, they might feel defensive. But that doesn't mean they don't want to hear you. Sometimes, the hardest thing to do is to be open about the pain. But trust me, she won't see it as blaming her. She'll see that you're coming from a place of love and care. And even if she's upset, even if it's hard, the fact that you're opening up to her will mean more than you realize." Elijah nodded slowly, absorbing Blake's words. He seemed less tense than before, but his shoulders still carried a quiet burden. "I don't want her to feel like I'm just adding to her problems," Elijah admitted, his voice small. "I understand," Blake said softly. "But sometimes, the best thing we can do for the people we love is to share the weight with them. You're not adding to her problems, you're helping her see that you're both in this together. And maybe, just maybe, it'll give her the courage to open up too." Elijah's eyes were focused on Blake, searching for reassurance. The boy was caught between his fear and his desire to connect, to heal the rift that had grown between him and his mother. It wasn't easy, and Blake knew that. But this was the path Elijah had chosen, a path that required stepping into the unknown, into the rawness of vulnerability. "Do you really think she'll understand?" Elijah asked, his voice laced with doubt. Blake nodded. "I do. I think she'll be relieved, even if it's hard for her at first. People often feel alone when they're struggling, but when someone reaches out, especially someone they love, it can be a game changer." You're not alone in this, Elijah. You never have been. Elijah's shoulders loosened a little. He still looked unsure, but there was a glimmer of something in his eyes, something hopeful, something that hadn't been there before. Blake could see the wheels turning in Elijah's mind as he processed everything that had been said. I'm scared, Elijah admitted quietly. But I guess if I don't do it now, I might never do it. Blake smiled warmly. And that's all anyone can ask for. You don't have to be brave all at once. But tonight, when you talk to your mom, just take that first step. The rest will follow. Elijah looked down at the floor, his hands fidgeting with the zipper of his jacket. After a few moments, he nodded slowly. I'll do it. I'm going to talk to her. Blake stood up and placed a hand on Elijah's shoulder. You've got this, Elijah. And remember, no matter what happens, I'm here for you. As Elijah walked out of the office that afternoon, there was a new kind of quiet around him. It wasn't the silence of someone who had given up, it was the quiet of someone who had finally decided to face what he had been avoiding. Elijah was moving forward, one shaky step at a time, but forward nonetheless. That evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, Blake couldn't help but wonder about the conversation Elijah was having with his mom. Was it as hard as Elijah feared? Was it everything he hoped it would be? Or was it just the beginning of something bigger, something that would take more time and effort to truly heal? He didn't know the answers yet, but he believed that Elijah was on the right path. The boy had taken the first step toward breaking the silence, toward bridging the gap between him and his mom. And sometimes, that was the hardest step of all. The following day, Blake couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. There was an energy in the air, an undercurrent of tension that Blake could sense even though he hadn't spoken to Elijah since their last meeting. He had thought about Elijah all night, wondering how the conversation with his mom had gone, how it had felt for the boy to finally take that step. When Elijah walked into Blake's office after school, his expression was unreadable. He stood in the doorway for a moment, as if collecting his thoughts before coming inside. His eyes were a little red, but there was a strange sense of calm about him, something that Blake couldn't quite place. Hey, Blake greeted, standing up from his desk. How did it go? You don't have to talk about it if you're not ready. Elijah closed the door behind him, stepping into the room slowly, as if his feet were heavy with something he wasn't sure he wanted to carry. For a long moment, he didn't speak, his gaze shifting toward the floor, then back up at Blake. It was hard, Elijah finally said, his voice tight. But I told her. I told her everything. I told her how scared I've been, how I feel like I'm losing her sometimes. How much I just want things to be okay, but I'm not sure how to fix it. Blake nodded, his heart heavy with understanding. He knew that words, especially the kind Elijah had shared, could carry immense power. But they could also leave scars, raw emotions exposed to the light. The aftermath of a conversation like that was never simple. How did she take it? Blake asked softly. Elijah paused, his face creased with thought. She didn't say much at first. She just kind of sat there. I think she was shocked, maybe, but I think it was a good shock. I could see it in her eyes, like she was realizing that I needed her just as much as she needs me. He exhaled, rubbing his hands over his face. It wasn't perfect, but it felt like something shifted. Like we were actually seeing each other for the first time in a long time. Blake smiled, pride swelling in his chest. That's huge, Elijah. That's progress. It doesn't feel like progress, Elijah murmured, sitting down in one of the chairs opposite Blake's desk. I mean, it felt good, but it also felt like a huge weight just came down on both of us. She started crying after I told her about all the stuff I've been dealing with. And I didn't know how to make it better, you know. I wanted to fix everything for her, for us, but it doesn't work like that. Blake leaned forward, his expression gentle. You don't have to fix everything, Elijah. Sometimes, the best thing we can do is be there for each other. You don't have to carry all the weight. You both are allowed to hurt, allowed to be vulnerable. You gave your mom something that she probably needed even more than you realized, your honesty. And sometimes that's the first step to healing. I guess, Elijah muttered. But now I feel like I'm stuck. Like things won't get better, or that. I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't have said so much. Blake studied Elijah for a moment. It was clear that Elijah was wrestling with guilt, with the idea that opening up could have somehow made things worse. But Blake knew that these feelings were just part of the process. Elijah, Blake began, his voice steady, you did the right thing. You spoke from the heart, and that's all you could do. It's not going to be easy. It's never easy to face the things we've been hiding, whether it's about our families, ourselves, or our fears. But that honesty is going to give both you and your mom a chance to heal. It's a step forward, not backward. Elijah looked down, chewing his lip. I don't know. I just wish it didn't feel so messy. Everything feels so unresolved. Blake nodded. Of course it does. It's going to feel messy for a while. But you've opened the door to something real, something that could lead to change, even if it's hard. Sometimes, the hardest part is just getting to that point, and you've done that. Elijah was quiet for a moment, processing Blake's words. He still seemed unsure, but there was something in his eyes that told Blake the boy was beginning to understand. The relief wasn't going to come all at once, it wasn't supposed to, but the fact that Elijah had taken that first step was a significant victory. It's just. I want to make sure she's okay, Elijah finally said, his voice quieter now. I want to make sure she knows that I'm not blaming her for anything. I don't know how to help her when I'm still trying to figure out what's going on with me. Blake gave a soft laugh, shaking his head. You're doing more than you realize, Elijah. Sometimes just being there, showing up, and telling the truth, that's all anyone can really do. And you've already done that. You're not responsible for fixing everything. You're responsible for being a good son, and that's what you're doing. Elijah looked up at Blake, his expression thoughtful. You really think so? Blake smiled warmly. I do. There was a long pause as Elijah absorbed Blake's words. The uncertainty still lingered in his eyes, but there was also a growing sense of determination. He had begun to let go of the burden of having to fix everything, of trying to hold everything together. The weight of responsibility had been heavy on his shoulders for so long, and for the first time, he was learning how to share it. Blake could see it in Elijah's face, the boy was beginning to understand that healing wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about fixing all the problems or making everything better in an instant. It was about the small steps, the honest conversations, and the willingness to be vulnerable. And though the road ahead might still be difficult, Blake knew that Elijah was on the right path. As the bell rang, signaling the end of another school day, Blake stood up and placed a hand on Elijah's shoulder. You've come a long way, Elijah. Keep taking those steps, one at a time. You're not alone in this. Elijah gave a small smile, more genuine than any Blake had seen in weeks. Thanks, Mr. Blake. I'll try. Blake watched as Elijah walked out of his office, his step still hesitant, but a little more purposeful. He was no longer the same boy who had first come to him, weighed down by secrets and fear. Elijah was starting to break free, to find his voice, and that, Blake realized, was the real beginning of healing. The days after Elijah's conversation with his mother were a whirlwind of emotions. It had been a raw, difficult exchange, but something shifted in the air. A tension had been broken, like a storm passing, leaving behind a temporary sense of calm. But Blake knew better than to think it was over. There was still so much left unsaid, so many layers left to uncover. Elijah's journey was only just beginning. Blake watched from his office window as Elijah walked through the schoolyard. His stride was more confident now, though his head was still often low, his hands buried in his pockets as if he were trying to protect himself. The walls he had carefully constructed around himself weren't going to fall overnight, but they were weakening, piece by piece. It was progress, slow but steady. That afternoon, after the last bell had rung, Blake found himself walking to the library, his thoughts lingering on Elijah. He'd seen the boy in the hallway earlier, and there was a glimmer of something new in his eyes, a spark, perhaps, or the beginnings of hope. It was hard to tell, but it made Blake wonder whether Elijah had begun to see the world a little differently after that conversation with his mom. Had it been the catharsis Elijah needed, or was it just another step in a much longer journey? Blake had always believed in the power of change, in the ability to evolve. But he also knew that healing didn't come easily. People often needed time, and more than anything, they needed someone to stand with them. He could tell that Elijah was still processing everything, still figuring out how to move forward, but Blake felt that now, more than ever, the boy needed a consistent presence in his life, a guide through the storm. When Blake entered the library, the familiar smell of old books and paper enveloped him. The place was quiet, save for the soft rustling of pages turning. It was Elijah's haven, a place where he often found refuge. Blake hadn't told him he was coming, but something told him he'd find Elijah here, still wrestling with his thoughts, trying to make sense of the chaos that had unfolded in his life. Sure enough, as Blake scanned the rows of bookshelves, he spotted Elijah in the far corner of the room. The boy was seated at a small table, his backpack slung over the chair beside him, and his face buried in a thick novel. His fingers absent-mindedly flipped through the pages, though it was clear that he wasn't really reading. His mind seemed far away. Blake approached slowly, not wanting to startle him. "Hey," he greeted softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mind if I sit?" Elijah looked up, his eyes flickering with mild surprise before they softened. "Oh, hey, Mr. Blake. Sure, I guess." He moved his backpack off the chair, making room for Blake to sit. Blake settled into the chair across from him, his gaze lingering on Elijah for a moment before speaking again. "You've been keeping to yourself a lot lately." Elijah didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked down at the book in front of him, as though searching for words in the pages. Finally, after a long pause, he spoke, his voice quieter than usual. "I don't really know what to do with myself anymore. I mean, it's like, everything's still the same, but it's not. Things are different at home, but I don't know if they're better yet." Blake nodded, understanding the complexity in Elijah's words. Healing wasn't linear, it wasn't about an immediate change. It wasn't about everything getting magically better overnight. It was about the small victories, the quiet moments of clarity, and the understanding that progress, however slow, was still progress. "It takes time," Blake said gently. "You're not going to have all the answers right away. It's okay to feel uncertain. What matters is that you're still trying." Elijah's eyes met Blake's, his gaze searching, as though he were looking for reassurance in those words. "But what if I don't feel like I'm doing enough? What if I'm just stuck?" Blake leaned forward slightly, offering Elijah a reassuring smile. "You're not stuck, Elijah. You're just in the middle of something big. It's okay to be in the middle. Just because you don't see the end doesn't mean it's not there. Sometimes you have to trust that the path will unfold, even if you can't see where it leads just yet." Elijah nodded, though his face was still clouded with doubt. He picked up the book again, but his fingers barely moved the pages this time. It was clear that the weight of everything he had said to his mother was still heavy on him. The fear, the uncertainty, the guilt, all of it had been laid bare, and now he had to figure out what to do with it. After a moment of silence, Elijah finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been thinking about what you said. About healing and taking small steps. But it feels like I'm just waiting for something to change. And I don't know what I'm supposed to do while I'm waiting." Blake gave a soft chuckle, leaning back in his chair. "You're not just waiting. You're living. And sometimes, living is the hardest part of healing. You don't have to know exactly where you're going. You don't have to have all the answers. You just have to keep going, one day at a time. Elijah didn't say anything for a while, but Blake could see the wheels turning in his head. The boy was starting to grasp the truth that healing wasn't about perfection, it was about progress. It wasn't about having everything figured out in the moment. It was about taking each day as it came, allowing the process to unfold naturally. "Thanks, Mr. Blake," Elijah said finally, his voice steadier than it had been when they first started talking. "I think I needed to hear that." Blake smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "Anytime, Elijah. I'm always here for you. And you don't have to do this alone." Elijah nodded, a small but genuine smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "I know. I guess, maybe I just need to start believing that things can get better." Blake's heart warmed. "And they will, Elijah. One step at a time." As the bell rang to signal the end of another school day, Blake stood up, stretching his arms. "Well, I should probably let you get back to your reading. But remember, I'm just a call away, okay?" Elijah stood as well, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. "Thanks again, Mr. Blake. I'll be okay." Blake watched Elijah leave the library, his steps a little lighter than before. There was still a long road ahead, but Blake could see the shift within the boy. Elijah was beginning to find his way, to see that the power to heal was within him. And for Blake, that was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment Elijah began to believe in his own strength. The week following Elijah's conversation with his mom felt different. There was a subtle change in the atmosphere at school, and even though it wasn't immediately obvious to everyone around him, Blake could sense it. Elijah was still reserved, still holding on to his burdens, but he had begun to show glimmers of something more, hope. Not the kind of hope that came with grand gestures or instant fixes, but a quiet, steady belief that maybe, just maybe, things could improve. Blake had kept his distance, as much as he wanted to push Elijah to talk more or to open up, he knew that the best thing he could do was let the boy take things at his own pace. Patience was key. Healing didn't have a clear timeline, it didn't come with an instruction manual. It was messy, unpredictable, and often frustrating. But Elijah had started to show that he was capable of finding his way. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Blake saw him again. Elijah had finished his homework early and was sitting at the back of the library, absorbed in a book, like he always did. Blake couldn't help but smile as he walked past the rows of bookshelves. Elijah was sitting near the same table they had spoken at a few days before. This time, though, his eyes were brighter, his posture more open, and he was reading more intently than he had the last time Blake saw him here. "How's the book?" Blake asked, sitting down across from him, offering a gentle smile. Elijah looked up, his eyes meeting Blake's for the first time with no hint of hesitation. "It's good. Really good, actually." He closed the book slightly, marking his place with a finger. "It's a mystery, and I guess I've been really into figuring things out lately." Blake raised an eyebrow, amused. "Sounds like a good escape." Elijah shrugged, the faintest of smiles pulling at his lips. "Yeah, kind of. I guess it helps me focus on something other than everything else that's going on in my life." Blake nodded. "Sometimes that's exactly what we need, something to distract us for a while. But I think you're starting to handle things a lot better now." Elijah's expression softened, but there was a shadow of uncertainty in his eyes. "I don't know if I am. I mean, yeah, things are better at home, but I still don't feel like I've done enough. Like I'm not. I don't know, moving forward enough." Blake smiled gently, leaning back in his chair. "You're moving forward, Elijah. Trust me, I can see it. You're showing up. You're working through your feelings, you're talking when you can, and most importantly, you're allowing yourself to be open. That's progress." Elijah seemed to mull over Blake's words, his eyes flicking down to the book in front of him, but there was a thoughtful expression on his face. After a moment, he spoke again, his voice more reflective. I don't want to mess it up. I don't want to go backwards, you know, Blake's heart went out to him. He could understand that fear, that anxiety that all the hard work would somehow be undone. But Blake also knew that no one ever moved forward in a straight line. Healing was more like a spiral, constantly turning, sometimes backtracking, but always leading toward a greater understanding of oneself. "Elijah," Blake said softly, his voice steady, "you're not going backwards. You're just learning how to move through the tough stuff. Some days will be harder than others, but that doesn't mean you've failed. It means you're still growing." Elijah's eyes lifted again, and there was something different in his gaze this time, something less uncertain. "Yeah, I guess that makes sense." Blake smiled warmly. "It's true. And one day, you'll look back and realize just how far you've come, even on the days when you didn't think you were making progress." A long silence passed between them, but this time, it wasn't awkward. It was comfortable, like two people who had reached a mutual understanding. Elijah, for the first time in what felt like forever, seemed to be at peace with the fact that he didn't have all the answers. The door to the library opened, and Blake glanced toward it briefly, spotting Mrs. Johnson, the school counselor. She waved at Blake as she passed, heading to the back to check on some students. She didn't look at Elijah, but Blake noticed Elijah stiffen slightly as Mrs. Johnson entered the room. "Everything okay?" Blake asked, picking up on Elijah's subtle change in body language. Elijah didn't immediately respond, but after a beat, he sighed and ran his hand through his hair. "It's just, sometimes I feel like I should talk to her. Like she's there, and I know she's good at helping people, but I'm just scared." Blake sat up straighter, leaning in slightly. "Scared of what?" "Scared of not knowing what to say," Elijah admitted, his voice quiet. "Scared that I'll mess it up, or that I won't be able to make sense of everything in my head." Blake could see the vulnerability in Elijah's eyes, the fear of not being understood, of not being able to communicate the depth of his pain. It was something Blake had seen in many of his students, the fear that talking would somehow make everything worse. "You don't have to have all the answers," Blake said, his tone soft but firm. "And you don't have to do it alone. Mrs. Johnson is there to listen, not to judge. It's okay to be scared, Elijah. It's okay to not have everything figured out. But talking to her, or even just starting with a conversation, could make a difference. You don't need to have it all planned out. Just take it one step at a time." Elijah seemed to consider his words carefully, his eyes flicking to Mrs. Johnson, who was busy organizing some paperwork at the back of the room. Then, finally, he nodded slowly. "Yeah, maybe I could. Maybe I should." Blake smiled, feeling a sense of pride swell in his chest. It wasn't about pushing Elijah into something he wasn't ready for. It was about giving him the space to come to these realizations on his own. As the afternoon wore on, Blake felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. Elijah was no longer just a boy who had been hiding behind walls of fear and doubt. He was beginning to realize that it was okay to be afraid, but that fear didn't have to control him. He was slowly learning to take those small steps, and that was all Blake could ask for. As Elijah packed up his things, ready to head home, he turned to Blake with a hesitant smile. "Thanks, Mr. Blake. I think I'm starting to get it." Blake clapped him on the shoulder gently. "You've got this, Elijah. One step at a time. I'm proud of you." Elijah walked out of the library, his steps still cautious, but with a newfound sense of direction. Blake watched him go, knowing that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but also knowing that Elijah had finally started walking it, on his own terms. The days that followed were a mixture of moments that could have been called small victories, but they were victories nonetheless. Elijah had started spending more time with Mrs. Johnson, the school counselor. He didn't have much to say at first, but just the fact that he was showing up, sitting in her office, and letting her guide him through his thoughts, was a huge step. There was a difference now, something that wasn't there before. Elijah was showing up for himself. Blake noticed the change. The boy wasn't as withdrawn as he used to be. His eyes didn't look as burdened, his shoulders weren't hunched as much. Elijah wasn't smiling a lot, but there was a quiet confidence in the way he carried himself. It was a subtle transformation, like the first signs of spring after a long winter, still cold, but warmer than before. It was Wednesday afternoon when Blake found himself sitting in his office, looking through a stack of paperwork. He wasn't normally the kind of person to get bogged down by administrative tasks, but he had to admit that the responsibilities of being the principal did require some attention. His mind kept drifting to Elijah, though. He wondered how the boy was doing, what kind of progress he was making, and if he was starting to feel any less alone. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on his office door. He looked up, surprised, and saw Elijah standing in the doorway, his hands shoved in his pockets. The boy looked hesitant, almost like he wasn't sure if he should be there. "Elijah?" Blake said, his voice warm and welcoming. "What's up?" Elijah shifted from one foot to the other, his nervousness palpable. I wanted to talk to you for a second. If you have time." Blake stood up and motioned to the chair across from his desk. "Of course, take a seat. What's on your mind?" Elijah hesitated but then walked over and sat down, his posture still a little closed, but there was something different about him today, something more determined. "I've been thinking," he started, his voice quiet but steady. "About what you said. About taking small steps and all that. I think I've been stuck for a while, you know. Like, I didn't really believe I could get out of the hole I was in." Blake sat back in his chair, listening intently. "And now?" Elijah took a deep breath, his eyes meeting Blake's with a newfound seriousness. "Now, I think I'm starting to see things differently. Like, maybe I don't have to be perfect. Maybe I don't have to have it all together to start making changes." Blake smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "That's exactly it, Elijah. Healing, growth, none of it is about perfection. It's about progress. And you're doing that." Elijah nodded slowly, as though he were trying to absorb the weight of those words. "I've been talking to Mrs. Johnson a lot. I mean, at first, I wasn't sure if it was going to help, but it's been okay. Like, she doesn't judge me or anything. She just listens." Blake's smile grew. "That's the most important part, you know. Sometimes all it takes is for someone to listen. You don't have to have all the answers, just having someone who understands makes a huge difference." Elijah looked down at his hands, a small frown pulling at his lips. "But I feel like there's still more I need to do. Like, I'm not completely okay yet. And I don't know how to fix everything all at once." Blake nodded, recognizing the struggle Elijah was facing. "You don't have to fix everything at once. You're not supposed to. And you don't have to do it alone, either. You've been taking the steps you need to take, Elijah, and that's all that matters right now. Healing takes time. There's no magic answer or shortcut. It's about doing the work, bit by bit, and letting yourself be patient with the process." Elijah was silent for a moment, clearly processing what Blake had said. He fiddled with the sleeve of his hoodie, looking down at the floor, then back up at Blake with an expression that was part unsure, part hopeful. "I guess. I just want to know that I'm not messing up, you know." Blake leaned forward, his voice calm and reassuring. "You're not messing up, Elijah. You're doing exactly what you need to do. It's not about getting everything right, it's about showing up for yourself every single day. You're making progress, and that's what counts." Elijah's eyes seemed to brighten a little, though the doubt was still there, lingering. "I guess I'll just keep trying, then." Blake smiled and gave a small nod of approval. "That's all anyone can do. Just keep trying." As Elijah stood to leave, he hesitated again, a look of quiet determination settling over his face. "And one more thing, Mr. Blake. I think I want to try out for the basketball team." Blake raised an eyebrow, surprised. Elijah had never shown any real interest in sports before, and the idea of him putting himself out there like that was a big deal. "That's great, Elijah. What made you decide that?" Elijah shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his hands still in his pockets, but there was a flicker of excitement in his eyes. "I don't know. I've been thinking about it a lot. I think it could help. Help me feel like I'm part of something. Like I have a place where I can just be me and not have to worry about everything else." Blake's heart warmed. It wasn't just about basketball, it was about Elijah trying something new, about him stepping outside of his comfort zone, and taking control of his own story. "That's a great decision, Elijah. I think it'll be good for you." Elijah gave a small smile, his posture a little straighter now. "Thanks. I think I'll go talk to Coach later." As he walked out of Blake's office, there was a palpable shift in the air. Elijah was taking ownership of his future in a way he hadn't before. He wasn't just waiting for change anymore, he was actively making it happen. Blake sat back in his chair, a feeling of satisfaction settling over him. It wasn't just about Elijah's progress, it was about the fact that the boy was finally starting to see his own potential, to believe in the possibility of a better future. And that, Blake knew, was the most important step of all. The morning of the basketball tryouts felt different. It was as if the entire school was buzzing with energy, the kind of nervous excitement that only a sports event could bring. Elijah could feel it too. He had woken up that day with a strange mix of anticipation and fear, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized that trying out for the team wasn't just about basketball, it was about breaking down walls he had built around himself. It was about proving that he could be more than the quiet, withdrawn kid who stayed in the background. It was about stepping into a new version of himself. Blake had known Elijah wasn't much for organized sports before, but there had been a shift lately. Over the past few weeks, Elijah had been spending time after school in the gym, watching the older kids practice, trying to learn the game. He wasn't the best, but Blake could see the determination in his eyes. Elijah was starting to believe in his own potential, and that belief was more important than anything else. As Elijah stood in front of the gymnasium on the morning of the tryouts, he felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. The usual nerves and self-doubt were still there, but they weren't as loud this time. He had been practicing, not just in the gym but with himself, fighting off the negative thoughts that had once held him back. He was no longer just the kid hiding in the library or the one who stayed quiet in class. He was more than that now. And today, he was going to show everyone, most importantly, himself, that he had more to offer. When he walked into the gym, he was greeted with the usual sounds of basketballs bouncing, sneakers squeaking on the polished floor, and voices calling out instructions. There were a few other kids there, some who had been on the team before, others who were just as nervous as Elijah. As he scanned the room, Elijah caught sight of Coach Turner, a tall, broad-shouldered man who had been teaching PE at the school for years. Coach Turner had a reputation for being tough but fair, someone who pushed his players to be their best. Elijah could see the intensity in the coach's eyes as he observed the students, sizing them up. "All right, listen up." Coach Turner's booming voice cut through the noise, and the gymnasium went quiet. "We're going to run through a few drills, see how you move on the court, and then we'll get into some scrimmages. Do your best, and don't hold back. I don't want to see anyone standing around. Got it?" The group nodded, and Elijah felt a flicker of excitement in his chest. This was it. The moment he had been preparing for. Blake had been right, he didn't need to be the best on the team, he didn't even need to impress everyone. He just needed to give it his all, to show that he was willing to put in the effort, and that he wasn't afraid to fail. He had to believe in his ability to improve, even if that meant starting small. The tryouts began with basic drills, dribbling, shooting, passing. Elijah took a deep breath and joined the others, doing his best to keep up. He wasn't the fastest, and he missed more shots than he'd like to admit, but he kept going. When it was his turn to dribble, he focused on maintaining control, keeping his head up, scanning the gym for the best place to move next. Every time he fumbled the ball, he didn't let it stop him. He simply picked it back up and kept going. As the drills continued, Elijah found himself growing more confident. The gym was no longer a place of intimidation, it was a place where he could move, where he could challenge himself. When it was time for the scrimmage, Elijah was paired with some of the other kids who had been practicing basketball for longer than he had, but that didn't deter him. He jumped in, moving with as much energy and focus as he could muster. He wasn't the star of the game. In fact, he made more mistakes than he could count. But there was something different about the way he played. He was present, he was involved, and he was trying. And that, Blake knew, was exactly what mattered. Elijah wasn't backing down anymore. He was no longer hiding. He was standing up for himself in a way he hadn't before. As the tryouts came to a close, Coach Turner gathered everyone in the middle of the gym. Elijah's heart was pounding in his chest, the adrenaline still pumping through his veins. He was exhausted, both physically and mentally, but there was a sense of pride that filled him. No matter the outcome of the tryout, he had shown up, and that in itself was a victory. "Good work today," Coach Turner said, his voice steady but encouraging. "We'll be posting the list of players tomorrow. Keep your heads up and keep working hard. Those of you who didn't make it, that doesn't mean you're done. This is just the beginning. Keep practicing, and we'll see what you can do." Elijah exhaled a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. The waiting was over for now. All he could do was trust that he had given his best effort. Later that afternoon, after the tryouts had ended, Elijah found himself walking back to the library. His legs were sore, but there was a lightness in his step, a quiet confidence he hadn't had before. When he opened the door to the library, he found Blake sitting at his desk, grading papers. He looked up and smiled when Elijah entered. "How'd it go?" Blake asked, his voice warm and eager. Elijah dropped his bag on the table and sank into the chair across from Blake. He didn't immediately answer, his mind still processing the day. After a moment, he finally spoke, his voice steady but with a quiet excitement. It was hard," he admitted, "but I did it. I actually tried. And I didn't give up. No matter how many times I messed up, I kept going. That feels like something." Blake's smile widened, and he leaned forward, his voice full of pride. "That's what it's all about, Elijah. You showed up, you worked hard, and you kept pushing yourself. That's a win, no matter what happens next." Elijah nodded slowly, the weight of the day sinking in. He wasn't sure what the outcome of the tryouts would be, but he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't the same person who had walked into the gym that morning. He had taken a step towards something bigger, and that was enough for now. "Thanks," Elijah said quietly, his voice filled with a new kind of gratitude. "Thanks for believing in me." Blake met his gaze, his expression serious yet kind. "You didn't need me to believe in you, Elijah. You just needed to believe in yourself." The days following the tryouts felt like an eternity. Elijah had learned a lot in such a short period of time, about basketball, about life, and most importantly, about himself. But now, as he walked the halls of the school, he couldn't shake the feeling of anticipation that sat heavy in his chest. The tryouts were over, and the waiting began. Coach Turner had said the list of players would be posted on Thursday afternoon, but the hours seemed to stretch on endlessly. Every time Elijah saw another student walk by, his stomach would knot, wondering if they had already heard the news or if they, too, were waiting for the same list to be revealed. Blake had checked in with him every day, offering encouragement and giving him space to process. It wasn't just about basketball anymore, it was about Elijah's journey of self-discovery. His willingness to step out of his comfort zone had already proven more than enough to Blake, but Elijah was still worried. He hadn't been perfect on the court, and there was a small voice in his head reminding him of all the times he had fumbled or missed a shot. But still, every morning, he walked into school with his head held just a little higher. He wasn't walking around with the same sense of defeat he had felt before. He was different now, more certain of his own strength, his ability to face challenges. Even if he didn't make the team, he had already won something bigger, the courage to put himself out there. Thursday arrived, and with it, the weight of Elijah's nerves felt unbearable. The sun was low in the sky, casting a warm glow across the parking lot as he approached the school. As he entered the main doors, he found his best friend, Malik, waiting by their lockers. Malik had been Elijah's steady support throughout the past few weeks, always encouraging him, always standing by his side. Malik greeted him with a grin. "So, the big day is finally here. You nervous?" Elijah smiled, but the nerves were unmistakable. "I don't know. I'm kind of scared, to be honest. What if I didn't do enough?" Malik shrugged, his tone easy. "You did more than enough. I saw you out there. You didn't quit, man. That's what matters. The rest of it? You can work on that. But if you're still here, still trying, that means you've already won." Elijah nodded slowly, trying to take in Malik's words. He had no idea what would happen next, but there was a sense of gratitude that filled him, knowing he had someone who saw his efforts. The bell rang, signaling the start of their first class, and Elijah did his best to push the worries aside as he sat down at his desk. He tried to focus on the lesson, but his mind kept drifting back to the gym and the tryouts. His thoughts were interrupted when a voice came through the loudspeakers, signaling the end of the school day. "Elijah West," the voice said, "please report to the gym for the basketball team announcement." His heart skipped a beat. The time had come. Elijah's legs felt like lead as he stood from his seat, gathering his things in a daze. He glanced at Malik, who gave him an encouraging thumbs up. Elijah forced a smile in return before heading toward the gym. When he reached the gym, the place was buzzing with energy. Students clustered together in small groups, some of them nervously chatting, others trying to act casual, like the announcement didn't matter at all. But Elijah could tell they were all feeling the same tension. He took a deep breath and walked to the center of the gym, where Coach Turner stood beside a bulletin board covered in papers. "All right, everyone," Coach Turner said, his voice loud and clear, "I know you're all eager to know. The basketball team roster is up. I want to remind you all that this is just the beginning. Whether you're on the team or not, this is about growth and getting better." Blake was standing nearby, watching with a quiet pride as Elijah walked closer. Their eyes met, and Blake gave him a small, encouraging nod. Elijah felt a flicker of reassurance in that brief glance. No matter what happened in the next few moments, he had already proven something to himself. Coach Turner stepped aside, revealing the list. Elijah's eyes darted to the top of the paper, where the names were listed, one after the other. His pulse quickened as he scanned the names, reading them over and over in his head. His fingers hovered over the sheet, each moment stretching into what felt like an eternity. And then, at the very bottom of the list, Elijah's heart stopped. His name was there. "Elijah West," the coach called out, his voice echoing across the gym. Elijah's breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, he was frozen in place. The reality of the situation hit him like a wave, and his chest swelled with an overwhelming mix of disbelief, pride, and joy. His name was on the team. The students around him were clapping and cheering, some slapping him on the back, while others looked at him with newfound respect. But in that moment, all he could focus on was the realization that he had done it, he had made the team. The hard work, the failures, the moments of doubt, had all led up to this point. And it felt incredible. But then, something else happened. Coach Turner's voice rang out again. "Let me remind you all that making the team isn't the end of the journey, it's just the start. The real work begins now." Elijah smiled to himself, the weight of the moment settling in. He had taken the first step, but this was only the beginning of a much longer journey. As the students filed out of the gym, congratulating each other and joking around, Elijah stood there for a moment, taking it all in. His heart was still racing, but now it was filled with excitement instead of fear. He had proved something to himself. He had made the decision to step forward, even when everything inside him was screaming to stay back. And he had succeeded. When Blake approached him, a proud grin stretched across his face. "I knew you could do it," he said, clapping Elijah on the back. Elijah met his gaze, his smile shy but genuine. "I couldn't have done it without your support, Mr. Blake." Blake smiled back, his voice soft with encouragement. "You did all the hard work, Elijah. You're the one who showed up. Now it's time to keep going, to keep pushing. But no matter what, you've already accomplished something big. Don't forget that." As Elijah walked out of the gym with his teammates, the world felt different. There was a sense of belonging now, a sense that he wasn't just the kid who sat alone in the back. He was a part of something, something bigger. And it was just the beginning. The days after the announcement felt like a whirlwind. Elijah had officially made the basketball team, and the reality of it still hadn't fully sunk in. Every time he looked at the list, he had to blink to make sure he wasn't imagining it. His name was there, alongside the others, and for the first time, Elijah didn't feel like an outsider. The first practice after the team announcement was held in the gym, and the energy in the air was electrifying. Elijah was nervous, but this time, it wasn't the crippling fear that had once kept him on the sidelines, it was the anticipation of what was to come. He was no longer a bystander to his own life, he was a part of something bigger. He was learning that sometimes, the hardest battles were the ones we fought within ourselves. As the team gathered, Coach Turner addressed them. "All right, this is where the real work begins," he said, his voice serious but full of excitement. "You've made it this far, but now it's time to prove that you belong here. We're going to push ourselves harder than we ever have before, because that's how we get better." The rest of the players nodded, eager and ready for the challenge ahead. Elijah felt a tightness in his chest, but it wasn't fear. It was determination. For the first time, he truly understood what Coach Turner meant. It wasn't about being perfect, it was about showing up, pushing yourself, and growing, even when it's difficult. As the practice began, Elijah was thrown into the thick of things. He was running drills, learning plays, and working alongside his teammates, many of whom had been playing basketball for years. Elijah was aware of how much catching up he had to do, but instead of feeling discouraged, he embraced the challenge. Every missed shot, every fumbled pass was an opportunity to learn. He wasn't here to be the best right away, he was here to improve, to be part of the team, and to keep growing. During a break between drills, Elijah found himself standing next to Blake, who was watching the practice with a thoughtful expression. Elijah couldn't help but smile at the sight of his mentor, his guide through this entire journey. Blake turned to him and said, "You're doing great, Elijah. Just keep at it. It's not about being perfect today, it's about showing up, again and again." Elijah nodded, the words sinking in. Blake had always been there for him, first as a teacher, and now as someone who believed in him, who saw him as more than just a quiet, withdrawn student. Blake had been right from the beginning, the real work wasn't about the tryouts or the team, it was about what Elijah was willing to do after that moment, to push himself forward even when it was difficult. The rest of practice flew by in a blur. Elijah was exhausted by the end, but he felt something inside of him that was new, a sense of belonging, a sense that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He wasn't just the kid from the library anymore, he was a member of the basketball team, part of a group that was working together towards something greater. The days turned into weeks, and with each passing practice, Elijah grew more confident. His skills on the court improved, but more importantly, so did his relationships with his teammates. At first, they had been hesitant, unsure of who Elijah was and how much he could contribute. But as they practiced together, they saw the same thing Blake had seen all along. Elijah wasn't just someone who showed up, he was someone who kept going, no matter how hard it got. And that's what made him valuable to the team. One afternoon, just before practice, Elijah was sitting in the locker room tying his shoes when he heard a familiar voice. "Elijah." He turned to find Malik standing in the doorway, a wide grin on his face. "What's up, man?" Elijah asked, feeling a surge of warmth at the sight of his best friend. Malik stepped inside, his hands in his pockets. "Not much. Just wanted to say that I'm proud of you, man. I knew you could do it." Elijah smiled, his heart swelling with gratitude. "Thanks, Malik. Honestly, it's been crazy. I don't even know how I made it this far, but I did it. I'm here." "You're here because you didn't give up," Malik said with a knowing look. "I've seen you work, Elijah. And you've come a long way. You're stronger than you think." For the first time in a long while, Elijah felt like he wasn't just fighting for a place on the team. He wasn't just trying to prove himself. He had already proven something far more important, that he was capable of change, capable of stepping up to the challenge, no matter how big or small. The whistle blew, signaling that practice was about to begin. Elijah and Malik exchanged one last grin before heading out onto the court. The weeks leading up to the first official game felt like a blur. Elijah spent hours in the gym, perfecting his dribbling, his shooting, his footwork. He didn't care that he wasn't the star player, he cared that he was growing, that he was becoming a better version of himself with every practice. Then, the day of the game arrived. The gym was packed with students, parents, and faculty, all eager to see the team in action. The energy was electric, and Elijah could feel the weight of the moment. As he stood at the sidelines, watching his teammates get ready, he could feel the nervousness creeping up his spine. But this time, it wasn't paralyzing, it was exciting. Blake stood next to him, offering a few last words of encouragement. "Remember, Elijah, this is what you've been working for. No matter what happens, you've already succeeded. Now, just enjoy the game and do your best." Elijah nodded, taking a deep breath as he stepped onto the court. The lights were brighter than he had imagined, the noise of the crowd louder. But as he dribbled the ball for the first time in the game, something clicked. He wasn't worried about the mistakes anymore. He wasn't worried about what anyone thought of him. He was just focused on the game, on doing his best, on being present. When he made his first basket, nothing too flashy, but enough to contribute, it felt like a small victory. The crowd cheered, and his teammates slapped him on the back, but Elijah didn't focus on the applause. He focused on the feeling of accomplishment inside. He had made it. And he was no longer the person he used to be. The game went on, and although the team didn't win that night, Elijah knew that the true victory wasn't in the scoreboard, it was in the growth, in the journey. He had faced his fears, worked hard, and pushed through, and that was something he would carry with him for the rest of his life. As the final buzzer sounded and the players gathered together, Coach Turner clapped his hands, bringing them into a huddle. "This is just the beginning," he said, his voice steady and proud. "You've all made incredible progress. Keep pushing yourselves, and we'll get even better." Elijah smiled, his chest swelling with pride. This wasn't just about basketball anymore. It was about everything he had overcome, about how far he had come. And as he stood there, surrounded by his teammates, he realized something important: he wasn't just part of a basketball team. He was part of something bigger, a family, a support system, a place where he belonged. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?